By 1965, most American families were sitting down to the same handful of dinners every single week. Tuna casserole on Wednesday, meatloaf on Thursday, and something from a can on the nights nobody felt like cooking. Those meals kept the kitchen running through the whole decade, and almost none of them survived it. They disappeared the way most 1960s dinners disappeared, not because anyone stopped liking them, but because the person who made them stopped cooking, and nobody wrote anything down. What is left are names on stained recipe cards and a few stubborn cooks who refuse to let them go. Some of the dinners ahead will surprise you. One was so cheap it barely counted as a recipe, and another fed a whole family from a single skillet for almost nothing. If this kind of cooking means something to you, hit subscribe so you never miss one. Here are 100 forgotten dinners from the 1960s that have faded into history. Number 15. Bird's Eye International Dinners. Bird's Eye tried something different in the 1960s. Instead of the standard American meat and potatoes layout, they offered themed dinners inspired by other countries. A Japanese-style teriyaki dinner, an Italian dinner with lasagna, a French dinner with crepes. Each tray came in packaging designed to look worldly, with illustrations of foreign landscapes and promises of authentic cuisine. None of it was authentic. The teriyaki was sweet and thick and tasted nothing like anything served in Tokyo. The French dinner was a crepe filled with cream sauce and chicken in proportions that would make a French cook walk out of the room. But in a decade when most Americans had never eaten actual Japanese or French food, these trays offered the illusion of worldliness for pocket change. Bird's Eye pulled the entire line when real international restaurants started opening in American cities, and the comparison became embarrassing. The freezer aisle in 1965 was 3 feet wide and 6 feet long in most grocery stores. The selection was small and the competition was fierce. Swanson, Banquet, Morton, and a handful of regional brands fought for that limited space with box art that showed meals no one would ever pull from the tray inside. The turkey on the box was golden and glistening. The turkey in the tray was gray and gelatinous. Everyone knew the gap existed, and nobody complained because the transaction was understood. You were not buying the meal on the box. You were buying 25 minutes of not cooking. You were buying a clean kitchen and a quiet evening. The food industry figured this out before anyone put it in those words. Convenience was the product. The turkey was just the wrapper it came in. And for one full decade, that bargain held without anyone objecting loud enough to matter. Number 18. Stuffed cabbage rolls. Boiled cabbage leaves wrapped around a filling of ground beef, ground pork, onion, and white rice, packed shoulder to shoulder in a deep pot, simmered for 2 hours in tomato sauce. Polish neighborhoods in Hamtramck and Buffalo called them golubki. Slovak families in Pittsburgh called them halupki. By the 1960s, the second generation had anglicized them to stuffed cabbage and served them on church basement tables every Friday during Lent. The dish was an immigrant inheritance that survived Ellis Island and 2 world wars. What it could not survive was the third generation moving to the suburbs and learning to call them weird. A retired mill worker in Cleveland still made 100 at a time and froze them in Maxwell House coffee cans. He died in 1991, and the recipe died with him. The grandchildren remembered the smell. They could not remember the proportions. The cabbage went back to coleslaw, the ground meat went into hamburgers, and the rice ended up in a side dish nobody named. And the dish became a memory of a smell instead of a recipe. Number 18 went from a Sunday tradition to a museum entry inside one generation. That was how fast a dinner could vanish. You could say the same thing about smoked salmon pâtés, really. They were such regular catches during everyone's daily fishing routine that nobody was ever hankering for salmon or complaining about how the economy has made even that expensive, though that's exactly what would happen later on. Smoked salmon pâté was this really savory and smoky dish, which was a perfect way to have a lot of savory-based fun during the holidays with salmon. But eventually, health-conscious eating put some dents in this dish's reputation. People started to leave dairy and cream-heavy dishes like this and instead went for low-fat, plant-based, and dairy-free diets, which were fundamentally different from what you were going for with a smoked salmon pâté. Then there's the matter of over-farming things, which is a bad habit Americans never really shake off entirely. Salmon was being fished almost too much, and laws needed to be put into place so that local salmon populations actually became safe again. Of course, over-farming also tends to lead to overexposure. It was seen as a luxury item back then, even though it was definitely easy to catch and buy. It was just prepared in luxurious ways, which gave it an air of royalty. But you spend a few years, or even a couple of decades, constantly eating salmon, and it loses that appeal. Nowadays, this dish is just a memory. The porcupine meatball looked like a trick and worked like one. Mix ground beef with raw, uncooked rice, dry, straight from the bag, shape into balls, drop into a pot with condensed tomato soup and half a can of water, lid on, simmer 45 minutes. What emerged had rice grains poking through the surface on every side like quills, cooked entirely inside the meat, each grain swollen and soft. The technique came from Depression-era cooks who found that raw rice in a meatball stretched the meat further while adding a texture nothing else could replicate, and it appeared in Betty Crocker's picture cookbook in 1950, one of the best-selling cookbooks in American history. By the 1960s, it was in every budget cookbook in America, recommended for one-person cooking. A half recipe made 3 or 4 meatballs, a complete solo dinner in its own sauce. The trick was leaving the lid completely alone for the full 45 minutes. The people who knew the recipe had been shown how. Everyone else lifted the lid early and wondered why the rice was still crunchy. Number 19. Canned chicken and dumplings. This was the meal that made a cold apartment feel like a house. You opened a large can of chunked chicken, drained most of the liquid into a pot, added water or a splash of milk, and brought it to a low simmer. Then you dropped in small spoonfuls of biscuit dough, the kind you made with nothing but flour, baking powder, a pinch of salt, and enough shortening to hold it together. Covered the pot and let the dumplings steam for about 15 minutes without lifting the lid. That part was important. If you peeked, the dumplings went flat. The chicken fell apart into soft shreds in the broth. The dumplings puffed up thick and pillowy, soaking up the liquid from underneath while staying dry on top. Some people added a spoonful of dried parsley or a shake of black pepper, but nothing else was required. This was comfort in its most basic mechanical form. Hot starch, warm protein, and a bowl that kept your hands from shaking on a cold night. Women in Appalachia and across the rural South made versions of this going back generations, long before the chicken came in a can. The canned version was faster, but the principle was the same. You stretched a small amount of meat into a full meal by surrounding it with dough and broth. The dumplings did the heavy lifting. The chicken was almost a garnish. Grandmothers made this when their grandchildren came to visit, and there was nothing else in the pantry worth offering. The kids never knew the meal was born out of necessity. They just remembered the dumplings. They remembered the steam rising when the lid came off and the way the whole kitchen smelled like flour and warm broth for the rest of the evening. Oyster stew was the Christmas Eve tradition that brought coastal flavors to holiday tables across America, even in landlocked states. Fresh oysters were gently poached in their own liquor with butter, cream, and just enough seasoning to enhance their briny sweetness. The stew was served in warmed bowls with oyster crackers floating on top, each spoonful delivering plump oysters in rich, silky broth. Families maintained this tradition from generations past, when oysters were abundant and affordable enough for working-class celebrations. The dish required restraint. Overcooking turned oysters rubbery. Too much seasoning masked their delicate flavor. Some families added celery or a touch of sherry, but purists insisted on simplicity. By the 1980s, oyster prices had risen and the tradition faded. Those who grew up with oyster stew Christmas Eves remember the ritual of shucking, the anticipation, and the briny warmth that meant the holiday had truly begun. Number 26. Bean soup with a ham bone. After a Sunday ham dinner, the bone went into a stock pot with dried navy beans, a chopped onion, and enough water to cover everything by 2 inches. You let it simmer for hours. The marrow dissolved into the broth. The beans softened until they split apart. By Monday evening, you had a pot of soup thick enough to hold a spoon upright, and it tasted like the ham dinner all over again, only richer. This was the original zero-waste cooking. The bone that most people today would throw away was the foundation of an entire second meal. A pound of dried beans cost pennies, the onion cost less, and the bone was already paid for. In the 1950s, a quarter had weight. It could buy a loaf of bread, a quart of milk, or a pound of ground beef depending on where you lived and what day it was. A dinner built around that coin was not an act of desperation. It was an act of arithmetic. Mothers and grandmothers ran their kitchens like accountants, stretching every cut of meat, every bag of flour, every last spoonful of drippings saved in a coffee can beside the stove. The meals on this list came from that discipline. They were not creative cooking the way food magazines later defined it. They were survival made into craft, practiced so often that the measurements lived in muscle memory and the results never varied by more than a pinch. When meat was scarce and paychecks had to stretch, dinner often started with one humble ingredient: potatoes. Cheap, filling, and always available, they could be transformed into just about anything. One particularly resourceful creation called potato sizzler involved grating them up, frying them in bacon drippings with a handful of onions, and stirring in a beaten egg to bind it all together. Crisp on the edges, hearty in the middle, and packed with smoky flavor, this simple dish had everything it needed to stand on its own as a meal. Bacon itself wasn't always in the budget, but the drippings? Those were liquid gold. Every working-class kitchen had a can of saved bacon grease sitting on the stovetop, ready to add flavor to whatever was cooking. Onions were another staple, cheap and able to stretch even the simplest dish into something satisfying. The egg, whisked in at the last moment, gave the sizzling potatoes just enough structure to hold together, making the meal feel a little more complete. For families who grew up on it, the smell of potatoes frying in a cast-iron skillet brings back memories of home. Number 16. Fried potatoes and onions, a cast-iron skillet, a spoonful of lard or bacon grease, and whatever potatoes you had on hand. You sliced them thin, layered them in the hot pan with sliced onions, and let them cook low and slow until the bottom layer went golden and crunchy. Flip the whole pile, season with salt and pepper, and wait again. That was the entire method. In Appalachia and across the rural South, fried potatoes and onions was the answer to the question of what to cook when the pantry was almost bare and payday was still 2 days away. A 10-pound bag of potatoes in 1958 stretched across 2 full weeks of dinners if you were careful with your knife. It was not exciting. It did not need to be. It was warm, and it was there. There is a particular kind of quiet in the kitchen of someone who cooks only for themselves. No children to call to the table, no spouse coming through the back door at 5:30. Just one plate, one glass, one fork laid down on the counter. Millions of American seniors eat alone every night, and many of the meals on this list were built for exactly that reality. Not portioned down from a family recipe, but designed from the ground up for one person, one appetite, and one burner on the stove. The sadness is not that they eat alone. The sadness is that so many stopped cooking altogether because someone told them it was not worth the effort for just one person. It is worth it. It always was. A pot of soup simmered for one is still a pot of soup made with care. Number 15. Water pie. You whisked a cup and a half of water, a cup of sugar, 2 teaspoons of vanilla, 4 tablespoons of flour, and 4 pats of butter, then poured the lot into an unbaked shell. The first printed recipe ran in California in 1886, but the dish came back during the Depression when cooks had no eggs, no milk, and no excuse to skip dessert. The flour and the sugar set the water into a gelatinous custard in the oven, the butter floated to the top in beads of yellow, and the whole thing sliced clean once it cooled. Your great-grandmother served it at a wake in 1934 in West Virginia. Nobody knew it was made of water. They asked her for the recipe. She just smiled and lied. The chemistry is sugar binding water into syrup, then flour, gelating it into a sliceable solid past 200 degrees. You do not need to know any of that to bake one. You just need to trust the oven for 45 minutes and walk away. Canned tomato sandwiches were the taste of summer when nothing else was left in the fridge. You'd pop open a can of whole or sliced tomatoes, drain them just enough to stop the bread from falling apart, then slather both slices with mayonnaise. A sprinkle of salt and pepper went on top, maybe a little sugar if you came from the South, and that was lunch done. It was cold, slippery, messy, and perfect all at once. The juice soaked into the bread, softening it until every bite felt like a mix of tang and cream. It wasn't a fancy sandwich, but it was the one that kept bellies full on long, hot afternoons when money ran out before the month did. Some people added lettuce if they had it. Most didn't bother. It was simple, nostalgic, and surprisingly satisfying. The flavor was sharp, honest, and comforting in a way that no processed meal could be. It didn't matter that it came from a can. It still tasted like home. Every bite told a story of resourcefulness and grace under pressure. For families in the 1980s, canned tomato sandwiches were proof that even the simplest things could feel like love. Tomato gravy over biscuits was summer's answer to milk gravy, using the garden's overflow when fresh tomatoes hung heavy on the vine. Grandma would chop ripe tomatoes roughly, not measuring, just eyeing what the meal needed, then cook them down in bacon drippings until they broke apart into thick sauce. Sugar was added by the pinch to cut the acid, flour by the handful to thicken, salt and pepper by instinct alone. The gravy turned a beautiful sunset orange, chunky in some spots, smooth in others, depending entirely on how Grandma felt that morning. She spooned it hot over fresh buttermilk biscuits, the tomato juice soaking into the flaky layers. This dish appeared during tomato season only, when the garden produced faster than families could eat or preserve. There was no winter version, no substitute, just the brief window when homegrown tomatoes made this possible. The recipe died with the grandmothers who never wrote anything down, trusting their daughters would watch and remember. Oxtail rice pilau carried African cooking traditions through generations of southern kitchens where nothing went to waste. Oxtails, once sold cheap to those who knew their value, were browned in a deep cast iron pot until caramelized, their collagen-rich meat promising silky richness after long cooking. Onions, tomatoes, and spices joined the pot before liquid was added, and everything simmered for hours. When meat began falling from vertebrae and cooking liquid had reduced to concentrated flavor, long-grain rice was stirred in to absorb every bit of goodness. The pilau finished covered, rice becoming tender while oxtails contributed gelatinous texture to bind everything together. This dish stretched protein across many plates, with rice carrying rich flavor far beyond what meat alone could provide. African-American families perfected this technique, understanding that bones held as much value as flesh when cooked with patience. The dish showed how immigrant cooking traditions adapted to available ingredients. Number 12. Hoppin' John. The oldest published recipe appeared in The Carolina Housewife by Sarah Rutledge in 1847. The dish originated with the Gullah people of the South Carolina and Georgia Lowcountry, descended from enslaved West Africans who brought both the recipe and the black-eyed pea crop to the Americas. By the 1950s, it was a one-pot tradition across the entire South. Dried black-eyed peas at 10 cents, a smoked ham hock at 20 cents, onion, garlic, and long-grain rice. You simmered the peas with the ham hock until tender, added the rice, covered the pot, and waited. The whole meal for 6 people cost under 60 cents. The ham hock was the cheapest pork cut available, essentially a bone with collagen and scraps. The dish encoded in its ingredients the resourcefulness of generations of families who had built an entire cuisine from what others threw away. On New Year's Day, eating Hoppin' John meant good luck. Collard greens meant money. Cornbread meant gold. The tradition was old enough that nobody remembered who started it. They just did it. Number 21. Banquet Enchilada Dinner. Banquet saw what Patio was doing and wanted a piece of the Mexican frozen dinner market. Their version was simpler. 2 beef enchiladas in red sauce with rice and beans on the side. The sauce was thicker than Patio's, the beef was grainier, and the tortillas fell apart if you looked at them wrong. Banquet priced it lower and pushed it into grocery stores across the Midwest and South. It sold well enough to stay on shelves for years, but it never earned the following that Patio built with their tamale and enchilada combination. Banquet pulled it quietly when their Mexican line stopped competing against the newer brands that came along in the 1970s. Nobody held a funeral for it. There was a ritual to those trays that nobody talks about anymore. You pulled one from the freezer, read the temperature on the box, slid it onto the oven rack, and waited. The house filled with that specific frozen dinner smell, somewhere between steam and tin and whatever seasoning powder the factory used that week. When the timer went off, you pulled it out with a dish towel because the aluminum edges could draw blood if you grabbed them careless. You peeled back the foil and the steam hit your face. It was never good the way a home-cooked meal was good. But it was done. It was hot. And it asked nothing of you except 25 minutes and an oven set to 425 degrees. For millions of people coming home tired, that was enough. That was the whole point. Number 21, chicken a la king in pastry shells. Diced cooked chicken folded into a sherry cream sauce with mushrooms, pimientos, and green peas ladled into a Pepperidge Farm puff pastry shell that you pulled out of the freezer that morning. It was the dish a hostess made when the boss came over. It was also what showed up at every wedding reception, club dinner, and junior league luncheon between 1955 and 1969. The writer Calvin Trillin once wondered in print where it had gone, because for 2 decades it was everywhere. Convenience killed it. By the 1980s, the pastry shells were hard to find and the sherry felt fussy. The recipe sits in 70-year-old binders, splashed and yellowed, waiting for a hostess who is not coming back. You will not find it on a restaurant menu in any major city. You will find it tucked inside a church cookbook from Indianapolis printed in 1968. Potato, bacon, and leek gratin was a really odd one. It was the perfect thing to warm those cold winter nights into something peaceful and comforting, and it was also a wonderful dish to serve at holiday feasts, dinners, and tables. It took the layers of potatoes, often really thinly sliced ones, and then some crispy bacon and leeks. You'd bake these with a really creamy sauce and cheese, and then when they were that perfect golden color, you knew they were done. They had a pretty crispy surface-level texture, but the inside was really soft and gooey. The thing is, as nice and healthy as this dish sounds, it's actually way too loaded with calories and carbs. This isn't what the people wanted going forward, and even keeping this dish as an occasional weekend go-to or a holiday-only meal wasn't working out. Let's be very real here. Nobody keeps that diet in mind when it's holiday season. And that's exactly why meals that lure you into a food coma like this one are so dangerous. You end up with thousands of calories in surplus before you even realize it. Plus, potatoes also suffered some of the same problems with overuse that we had with salmon and mushrooms. Potatoes, next to corn, were the easiest crop you could farm and harvest, and they've been a sidekick to pretty much every mainstream American dish. Rice bowls, potato wedges, burgers, fries, steaks, mashed potatoes, you get the picture. Over time, people just got tired of the starchy flavor and wanted to leave it behind. Who knows? Maybe we could see a comeback. Do you think that's in the cards for all this lost 20th century cooking? Egg foo young was the exotic dinner you made for pennies, the meal that let someone in a studio apartment feel, briefly, like the takeout window was open just for them. The recipe appeared in 1960s cookbooks everywhere, Better Homes and Gardens, Betty Crocker, women's magazines, because Chinese American food had become something home cooks wanted to approximate without going out. Beat eggs with drained canned bean sprouts, sliced scallions, a spoonful of soy sauce, and whatever cooked chicken sat in the refrigerator, then fry small patties in oil until the bottoms browned. The brown gravy, beef broth thickened with cornstarch, a little soy for color, went poured over the top. The dish had roots in Cantonese cooking, but the American home version was its own invention, softer and adapted to whatever the cabinet held. The women who made it wrote the recipe on index cards and gave copies to their daughters. Most of those cards are in junk drawers now, ink faded past reading. Number 15, canned roast beef over white bread. You opened a can of roast beef in gravy, heated it in a saucepan until the gravy bubbled, and poured the whole thing over 2 slices of plain white bread on a plate. The bread soaked up the gravy and went soft while the beef sat on top in thick, tender shreds. Some people added instant mashed potatoes on the side to catch the extra gravy. This was an open-face hot sandwich that diners used to serve for less than $1. When seniors made it at home with a can from the shelf, it cost even less. The bread turned translucent under the weight of the gravy, and you ate it with a fork and knife like you were sitting at a lunch counter downtown. The presentation was nothing. The taste was everything. There is a particular silence in a kitchen where only one person eats. The burner clicks on. The can opens. The plate goes down on the table across from an empty chair. Millions of seniors in this country eat alone every single night, and most of them stopped cooking real meals years ago. Not because they forgot how, because cooking for one feels like a confession that nobody is coming, but the ones who kept opening those cans, who kept heating the skillet, who kept setting a place at the table even when the other chair stayed empty, they understood something that the rest of us are still learning. Feeding yourself is not giving up. Feeding yourself is the last act of refusing to. Creamed onions were the pearly white side dish that appeared in silver serving bowls at Christmas dinners across America, their mild sweetness balanced by rich bechamel. Small pearl onions were peeled by hand, a tedious job that left cooks weeping but yielded incomparable results. The onions were simmered until just tender, then folded into a sauce of butter, flour, cream, and sometimes a touch of nutmeg that coated each pearl in velvety richness. The finished dish looked almost like a dessert, the pale onions glistening in their creamy bath. Families passed the bowl around the table, spooning modest portions alongside roast beef or turkey. The flavor was subtle, the onions sweet and soft against the rich sauce. Making creamed onions from scratch required patience and skill, the sauce needing constant attention to prevent lumps. By the 1980s, frozen pearl onions and canned cream soups had replaced the handmade version, and eventually the dish vanished entirely from most Christmas tables. Number 21. Fried salt pork with milk gravy. A slab of salt pork sliced into thin strips, soaked in water to pull some of the brine out, then dredged in flour and fried in its own rendered fat until the edges curled and crisped. The drippings stayed in the skillet. You whisked in flour, poured in milk, and stirred until a thick white gravy formed around the brown bits stuck to the pan. Served over biscuits or boiled potatoes, this was a meal that families in Appalachia and across the rural South ate multiple times a week. Salt pork kept for months without refrigeration and cost next to nothing at the general store. The gravy stretched a few thin slices into a full plate, and the salt from the meat seasoned the whole dish without reaching for the shaker. Most of the women making these dinners did not choose it as a hobby. The kitchen was a workstation. Dinner happened every night at the same hour because the family expected it, the budget demanded it, and there was no alternative sitting in a paper bag at a drive-thru. That daily discipline created something no delivery app has ever reproduced. A table where people sat together, ate the same food, and stayed until the plates were cleared. You can order a meal to your door in 15 minutes today, and it will arrive in a bag you throw away before you sit on the couch alone. The meals were simple. The ritual around them was not. Long before store-bought bread was an everyday staple, cornmeal was the backbone of many working-class meals. Cheap, shelf-stable, and endlessly versatile, it found its way into countless recipes, none more practical than corn dodgers. These simple golden brown dumplings were either fried to crisp perfection or baked until firm, then served with a drizzle of syrup or a pat of butter. Corn dodgers were a direct descendant of Depression-era survival cooking, when wheat flour was too expensive for daily use. Cornmeal, on the other hand, was affordable and widely available, especially in the South and Midwest. Mixed with a little water, salt, and sometimes a splash of milk, it formed a dough sturdy enough to hold its shape in the frying pan. The result was a crispy on the outside, tender on the inside bite of pure comfort. Paired with a bit of molasses or honey, whatever was on hand, it became a meal that kids actually looked forward to. Some families made them dense and chewy, while others leaned toward a lighter, almost hush-puppy-like texture. However they were served, one thing was certain. Corn Dodgers proved that even the simplest ingredients could be transformed into something satisfying. No frills, no waste, just good, honest food. Number 3. Pot roast stretched across 3 days. A cheap chuck roast, 3 or 4 pounds, seared in a Dutch oven, and then braised low and slow for hours with onions, carrots, potatoes, and a cup of water. Day 1 was the roast dinner itself, carved thick and served with the soft vegetables and the pan juices poured over the top. Day 2, you shredded the leftover meat and piled it on white bread for hot beef sandwiches with gravy ladled over everything. Day 3, the bones and scraps went into a pot with whatever vegetables remained in the crisper, and you simmered it into a beef vegetable soup that tasted richer than anything you could buy in a can. 3 full dinners from 1 piece of meat. That was the math that kept families fed in the 1960s, and the women who did it needed nothing but a Dutch oven, a sharp knife, and the deep understanding that nothing edible gets thrown away. The pot roast was not one dinner. It was a 3-day plan, and the plan was simple. Everybody eats this week. Number 22, mock apple pie from Ritz crackers. You broke up 36 Ritz crackers into a pie shell, poured a sugar syrup of water, sugar, lemon juice, and cream of tartar over the top, dusted it with cinnamon, and baked it for 30 minutes. What came out tasted enough like apple pie that grown men asked for seconds. Ritz hit shelves on November 21, 1934, at 19 cents a pound, and within 3 years they were the best-selling cracker in the world. Apples were expensive, crackers were cheap. The cream of tartar mimicked apple's tart bite, and the lemon did the rest. By the Second World War, Nabisco was printing the recipe on every blue cracker box. Your grandmother served it at church suppers. Nobody guessed, but you could only pull it off if you served it warm. Cold mock apple pie tasted like a soggy cracker, and that was the rule every Depression-era hostess passed down without writing it on the recipe card. Tomato custard casserole turned 2 everyday items, canned tomatoes and eggs, into a richly flavored dinner that captured the resourcefulness of the 1960s. The eggs were whisked with milk and a pinch of sugar before being poured over chopped tomatoes and breadcrumbs, then baked until the custard set and the top turned slightly caramelized. This casserole provided protein, vitamins, and comfort all in one dish without requiring expensive meats or elaborate preparation. Many families served it with buttered toast or a simple green salad, letting the natural acidity of the tomatoes balance the creamy custard. The recipe became a reliable weeknight option because it used inexpensive pantry staples that were always on hand. Its smooth texture and gentle sweetness made it appealing to children, while adults appreciated the subtle complexity that developed as the tomatoes baked. This unassuming casserole is a testament to how mid-century cooks could transform basic ingredients into something hearty, nourishing, and surprisingly elegant with little more than patience and a hot oven. Dumplings and wild greens was the spring celebration meal when foraged foods meant fresh nutrition after months of preserved vegetables. Grandma would gather whatever was ready: dandelion greens, lamb's quarters, wild mustard, washing them thoroughly in multiple water changes. The greens simmered with salt pork until tender, their pot liquor becoming rich and slightly bitter. Meanwhile, she mixed dumpling dough by feel: flour, a bit of lard, enough liquid to hold together, then dropped spoonfuls directly into the bubbling greens. The dumplings puffed and cooked through, absorbing the flavors of greens and pork. This dish required knowing which wild plants were edible, when they were tender enough to eat, and how to cook dumplings that were light rather than leaden. No measurements existed because the greens varied every gathering, and Grandma's hands knew what her eyes confirmed. It tasted like the earth waking up, like survival, like spring itself served in a bowl. Pork jowl and turnip greens came together in a single pot to create something far greater than either ingredient could offer alone. Pork jowl, fatty, flavorful meat from a pig's cheek, often smoked or cured, gave richness that infused everything it touched. The jowl went in first, rendering its fat while developing a crispy exterior. Turnip greens gathered from fall gardens after frost sweetened their leaves were added in great handfuls along with water, vinegar, and a touch of sugar to balance natural bitterness. The pot simmered for hours, greens cooking down to silky tenderness while absorbing smoky pork flavor throughout. Families valued this because both ingredients were home-raised or home-grown, requiring no cash outlay. The pot liquor was never discarded. It was sipped with cornbread or saved for soup. This was peasant food elevated through understanding that slow cooking and good fat could transform the humblest vegetables into something approaching luxury. Number 20. Creamed tuna on toast. Every Friday in Catholic America, millions of families needed a cheap dinner with no meat. The Catholic Church's Meatless Friday rule, which stayed in place until 1966, created guaranteed demand for this dish in cities like Boston, Chicago, Philadelphia, and New Orleans. You made a white sauce in one saucepan, butter, flour, milk. You folded in a can of tuna at 25 cents and a handful of frozen peas. You poured it over toast. The whole meal cost about 55 cents. It was the same dish as creamed chipped beef, only with fish instead of dried meat. Children who grew up in Catholic households in the 1950s remember it as the taste of Friday. Some remember it with nostalgia. Some remember it with dread. Most remember both at the same time. The Meatless Friday rule shaped an entire generation of home cooking. When the rule was relaxed in 1966, creamed tuna on toast disappeared from millions of kitchens almost overnight. The dish had no loyalty outside the obligation. Number 19. Howard Johnson Fried Clam Dinner. Howard Johnson was a name that meant something in the 1960s. Those orange-roofed restaurants lined the turnpikes and highways from Maine to Florida, and families planned road trips around stopping at one for fried clams and ice cream. So when Howard Johnson put their name on a frozen dinner, people paid attention. The fried clam platter was one of their signature offerings translated to the home freezer. The tray came with a pile of breaded clam strips, French fries, coleslaw, and a lemon wedge that was more decorative than functional after 30 minutes in a hot oven. The clam strips were small and heavily breaded, the kind where you ate 3 before you found an actual piece of clam, but the coating crisped up in the oven in a way most frozen dinners could not manage. Howard Johnson charged more than Swanson or Banquet because they were selling a restaurant name, and for a while it worked. People felt like they were eating restaurant food at home, even though the gap between the highway version and the frozen version was wide enough to drive a station wagon through. The frozen line expanded to include macaroni and cheese, chicken croquettes, and other restaurant staples. But Howard Johnson, the restaurant chain, started closing locations through the 1970s, and the frozen dinners lost their anchor. Without those orange roofs reminding people what the brand stood for, the trays stopped moving. The frozen line disappeared entirely. Today, the Howard Johnson name belongs to a budget hotel chain, and almost nobody remembers you could once pull a fried clam platter out of your home freezer with that same logo on the box. Number 24. Creamed chipped beef on toast. Thin slices of dried, salted beef pulled from a small armor glass jar, stirred into a roux of butter, flour, and whole milk, then poured over toasted Wonder Bread. The Army called it SOS. The Navy made it with tomato. Civilian families inherited it from fathers who had eaten it on ships and at Fort Bragg. It became a Sunday night supper because it cost almost nothing and could be on the table in 12 minutes. Picture a husband home from second shift, eating it standing at the counter while the kids did homework. By the late 1960s, the armor jar was migrating to the back of the grocery shelf. The veterans who learned to love it began passing, and their grandchildren had no taste for the salt or the memory. The dish refused to disappear in military families where you could still find it on a Sunday plate as late as 1978, and the recipe still works the way it used to, but the audience for it does not. Pear and pomegranate lamb tagine was a very aromatic and lovely dish right from the heart of Moroccan and North African kitchens and homes, and for a while, there was a lot of steam behind this. It was named after the earthenware pot it's cooked in, which is a tagine. It was one of the biggest examples of why slow cooking really was the way to go if what you were looking for was tender and flavorful meat. And despite the advent of actual slow cookers, people didn't really want to break away from tradition. Pomegranate and pears also had a place in Moroccan tradition, as the former was seen as a sign of peace, while the latter was often used in tagines wherever they were made. This was a popular item during weddings, Ramadan, or even Eid, and it was being made in Muslim communities. Unfortunately, it just takes so long to prepare. It's a lot more complicated than one realizes, and not everyone has clay pots lying around. If you replace that integral part of the dish, you just don't get the same flavor anymore. The box of rice-a-roni had been in American cabinets since 1958, and by the early 1960s, it had become the standard dinner for anyone cooking alone who wanted something that felt more like cooking than it was. The technique was everything. Melt butter in the skillet, add the dry rice and broken vermicelli from the box, and toast them together, stirring constantly until the pasta turned amber and the rice went translucent. Then water, then the seasoning packet, lid on, heat down. Those 2 minutes of dry toasting gave the dish a nutty depth that plain boiled rice never had. The step people who didn't know the rule always skipped, wondering later why theirs tasted flat. Golden Grain Company developed the original in San Francisco, after co-founder Vince DeDomenico watched a neighbor combine rice and pasta in the early 1950s. 19 cents a box. You could eat it plain. You could pull in a leftover chicken thigh and call it a proper dinner. Either way, it was ready before you finished changing out of your work clothes. Number 16. Canned beef ravioli. You opened the can, poured the ravioli into a saucepan, and heated it over medium until the sauce started to bubble around the edges. That was the whole recipe. The ravioli came already stuffed, already sauced, already seasoned. All you had to do was get it warm. Chef Boyardee was the name on most of those cans, and millions of people grew up eating it straight from the pot with a spoon because transferring it to a bowl felt like a wasted step. The beef inside the pasta pockets was soft and finely ground, more paste than meat, but it carried enough flavor to make every bite feel intentional. Seniors ate this on nights when standing at the stove for more than 5 minutes felt like too much to ask. 1 can, 1 burner, 1 pot, and dinner was done before the evening news came on. Beef Wellington was the ultimate expression of holiday extravagance, wrapping prime beef tenderloin in mushroom duxelles and flaky puff pastry. The preparation took hours, searing the beef, cooking down finely chopped mushrooms until they were practically dry, wrapping everything in pastry and chilling until firm. Timing the bake was crucial. The pastry needed to turn golden while the beef inside stayed perfectly pink. Slicing revealed beautiful cross-sections of meat encased in mushroom and pastry that made guests audibly gasp. This was company food, reserved for Christmas Eve dinners when important guests were coming or when families wanted to prove their sophistication. The dish required expensive ingredients and considerable skill, making it a status symbol as much as a meal. Beef Wellington represented the aspirational cooking of the era, when home cooks attempted restaurant-quality dishes to impress. It has largely vanished from home kitchens, relegated to expensive steakhouses where few experience its former glory. Number 29. Sloppy Joes. Ground beef browned with onion, then stirred together with ketchup, a little mustard, Worcestershire sauce, and brown sugar until the mixture turned thick and sweet and tangy. You spooned it onto a soft hamburger bun and ate it with both hands. The name was honest. There was no clean way to eat one. Children loved them because they were messy and sweet. Parents loved them because a pound of beef and a bottle of ketchup produced enough filling for the whole family. School cafeterias served them by the hundreds. Church fellowship halls put them out on steam tables. In the 1950s, sloppy joes were everywhere, and the only rule was that the bun had to be soft enough to absorb the sauce without falling apart. Before I go any further, for the folks who want more of these old recipes gathered in one place, I put together a collection called The Vintage Recipe Guide. You can find it on my website, vintagelifestyleusa.com. I will not bring it up again. If you want it, it is there. Now back to the list. When dinner had to come together fast and money was tight, there was one golden rule. Nothing went to waste. Leftover potatoes, stray bits of meat, a spoonful of peas from last night's dinner, it all had a place in the baking dish. Held together with a can of condensed soup or a ladle of thick gravy, garbage plate casserole was less about following a recipe and more about cleaning out the fridge. Working-class families in the 1960s didn't have the luxury of throwing away food, and casseroles like this turned scraps into something filling. Canned soups, especially cream of mushroom or cream of chicken, were kitchen workhorses, stretching ingredients while adding richness. Crackers or breadcrumbs on top gave it that familiar golden crust, making it feel like a meal rather than a collection of leftovers. It was never the same dish twice, but that was part of its charm. One night it might taste like last Sunday's roast beef. The next, it had the essence of yesterday's pork chops. No one knew exactly what they were going to get, but that didn't matter. It was warm, it was filling, and most importantly, it was a reminder that a little creativity could turn scraps into supper. Cornbread and milk was a Southern lullaby disguised as dinner. You took day-old cornbread, dry, crumbly, almost stale, and dropped it into a glass of cold milk. No sugar, no spice, just spoon and memory. It was humble food, the kind you did not question because your grandparents ate it too. Some people used buttermilk, others regular. It depended on what was left in the fridge and how soft you needed the bread to be. You ate it with a spoon, slowly, like it was soup. It filled you without asking for attention. It was cheap, simple, and oddly soothing. There was something honest about it, like admitting you had little but making peace with it anyway. In some homes, this was a treat. In others, a last resort. Either way, it kept bellies full and silence at the table. That matters more than most people know. Number 14, vinegar pie. You stirred half a cup of white vinegar into hot water, added a cup of sugar, 2 beaten eggs, 3 tablespoons of flour, a pat of butter, and a pinch of nutmeg. What came out of the oven tasted like a lemon meringue pie that had never seen a lemon. Vinegar pie traveled on wagon trains from Tennessee to Oregon and fed Laura Ingalls Wilder's family on the Dakota Prairie. The acid bit. The sugar covered it. The custard set in 25 minutes at 350. Your great-grandmother called it desperation pie. She made it on a Sunday when the preacher was coming. He asked for 2 slices, and the genius was the temperature of the water before the vinegar went in. The hot water dissolved the sugar all the way through, and only then did the cold acid hit, which kept the egg from scrambling on contact and gave the custard its silky texture. She brought the kettle to a near boil before she started. Hot grits with bacon drippings were the winter breakfast that kept families warm long before the sun climbed up over the rooftops. Grits were cheap, filling, and dependable, which made them perfect for cold seasons when the body needed something hearty to face the day. Grandma saved every spoonful of drippings from the skillet, pouring them into a jar she kept near the stove like it was treasure. When the water boiled and the grits began to thicken, she added a little scoop of those drippings, stirring slowly until the pot turned creamy and rich. The smell alone was enough to pull children from warm beds. This breakfast did not need anything fancy. The flavor came from the memory of yesterday's meal and the promise of today's strength. It tasted like warmth you could hold in your hands, the kind that spread through your chest and made winter mornings feel possible. This was not restaurant food. This was real food made by people who understood how to stretch flavor across days. Hot grits with bacon drippings tasted like comfort, resourcefulness, and the quiet determination to start the day with something good. Chicken and slick dumplings was Sunday dinner comfort that required no recipe, only patience and hands that knew dough. Grandma would simmer a whole chicken for hours until the meat fell from the bones, creating rich golden broth that filled the kitchen with promise. She pulled the meat into shreds and returned it to the pot while mixing dumpling dough from flour, chicken fat, salt, and just enough broth to hold together. Rolled thin on a floured board and cut into strips, these slick dumplings went into the bubbling pot where they cooked into silky ribbons that soaked up chicken flavor. The result was neither soup nor stew, but something in between. Thick, hearty, and deeply satisfying. Every grandmother's dumplings tasted different because every grandmother's hands worked differently, rolling thicker or thinner. This was cold weather food, sick day food, company's coming food. The technique passed through watching, through standing beside grandma at the counter, through years of practice. Shrimp purloo was the Low Country's answer to feeding a crowd when the creeks were running with shrimp and the pantry held little else but rice. Fresh-caught shrimp were cooked shell-on in a deep cast-iron pot with bacon, onions, and tomatoes until their juices enriched the cooking liquid. Rice went directly into that flavorful broth, absorbing every bit of shrimp essence as it simmered to tender perfection. The dish was somewhere between a pilaf and a jambalaya, uniquely southern and deeply tied to coastal communities where shrimp were plentiful and free for those willing to cast nets. Families gathered for purloo suppers that turned a good catch into celebration, the one-pot meal serving dozens without requiring anything beyond what the water and garden provided. The shrimp were peeled at the table, their shells having already given everything to the rice. This was community food that brought neighbors together over something simple but profoundly satisfying. Number 15. Chicken fricassee. The dish had been in American cookbooks since the 18th century. Mary Randolph published a version in The Virginia Housewife in 1824. By the 1950s, convenience food had changed it completely. Poppy Cannon's Can Opener Cookbook in 1953 reduced the recipe to a single instruction: open a can. The home version was not much harder. You browned chicken pieces in a Dutch oven, added a can of cream of chicken soup, sliced mushrooms, onion, celery, and a splash of white wine. You covered it and simmered for 45 minutes. The whole meal cost about $1.20. Chicken fricassee had a French name. In the 1950s, that alone elevated a Tuesday dinner into something that felt like you were trying. Most women in America were making it from a can of soup. Nobody talked about that part. The name did the work. It made a 10-cent can of soup taste like ambition. Number 16. Nighthawk Frozen Steak Dinner. Nighthawk was a Texas brand that did one thing and did it with conviction. They froze a real charcoal-broiled steak and put it in a box with a baked potato and a vegetable. No gravy, no sauce, no apologies. The steak was thin, but it was actual steak, not a pressed patty or a processed loaf shaped to resemble one. Nighthawk sold mostly in the South and Southwest, and the people who knew the brand were loyal to it in a way that national brands could never earn. The box showed a cowboy hat and a steak with grill marks, and the product inside came close enough to matching that promise. They stayed in business for decades, outlasting bigger brands in their region because they never tried to be anything other than a steak dinner in a box. When Nighthawk finally disappeared from store shelves, steak lovers in Texas noticed and mourned it like a neighbor who moved away. Number 14. Meatloaf with ketchup glaze. 2 pounds of ground chuck mixed with a sleeve of crushed saltines, a small grated onion, 2 eggs, a splash of whole milk, and a heel of stale bread soaked soft. Pressed into a Pyrex loaf pan, slathered with a half cup of Heinz ketchup and a tablespoon of brown sugar, baked an hour at 350. The whole thing cost $1 and fed 5 people with leftovers for sandwiches the next day. Every American kitchen had a version of it. The recipe was on the back of the saltine box, on the side of the ketchup bottle, in the family Bible. Nobody measured. Through the 1960s, meatloaf was Tuesday dinner and reheated lunch and the cold sandwich a husband took to the plant in a tin pail. It survived because it was forgiving. A cup more breadcrumbs, a little less meat, an onion if you had one. The dish carried families through every paycheck week and every layoff. Then, in the 1990s, ground beef got more expensive than chicken breast, and the saltines started costing more than the ground beef. Meatloaf moved to once a month, then to never. Today, it is a chalkboard special at a diner that calls itself retro, served with mashed potatoes you did not make. You can still pull a Pyrex loaf pan out of any thrift store in the country for $2. The pan outlived the dinner. Chestnut stuffing is a pretty classic savory dish that was always traditionally associated with the holidays, perhaps even more so than everything else on this list so far. The star ingredients this time were roasted or boiled chestnuts, and they gave a pretty new spin on the otherwise very typical bread stuffings that would get passed around Christmas and Thanksgiving. Back then, stuffing recipes were also more of a cherished and higher class item. It was harder to make proper stuffings, so whenever someone did, it was always because some holiday or the other was happening. Plus, Americans had a bit of a soul-searching phase, but with food. They started to constantly see what else they could do with the formats they were familiar with. For example, we all love stuffing, right? So the thought process back then was, how could you make stuffing more varied? Think about it yourself. How different are the stuffings you make from the stuffings of yesterday, especially the 20th century? Or how hard is it to make these for you? Eventually, people started the road that led to us having such an easy time with these, and it meant abandoning labor-intensive things like chestnut stuffings in favor of easier, more modern and global tastes that were popular around the world. If rice-a-roni was what you made when the cabinet was stocked, cream of mushroom pork chops was what you made when the refrigerator held exactly one pork chop and a single can of Campbell's. Season the chop, brown it in butter, move it to a baking dish, pour the condensed soup directly over the top, undiluted, straight from the can, and bake at 350 degrees for 30 minutes. The steam and the meat's own moisture thinned the soup to a sauce, and the chop came out tender, sitting in a pale gravy you mopped up with bread. Campbell's had been suggesting this combination since the early 1950s, and by the 1960s it appeared in household recipe files under names like Company Pork Chops, even when the only company was the cook. The knowledge that one can and 30 minutes could turn a thin pork chop into something genuinely good traveled neighbor to neighbor over back fences, written on cards, shared in parish newsletters. Then it just stopped being passed. Number 14. Corned beef and cabbage. You did not need the whole brisket and the all-day boil. You needed a can of corned beef and half a head of cabbage. Sliced the cabbage into thick wedges, boiled them in salted water until they went soft, and then crumbled the canned corned beef into the pot for the last 5 minutes so it heated through and broke apart into the cabbage. Drained most of the water, added a knob of butter and some black pepper, and served it in a bowl. This was the version that Irish and Eastern European families on the East Coast made when the real thing was out of reach. The canned corned beef was saltier and denser than the fresh cut, but it worked. It always worked. The cabbage softened into something sweet and almost silky, and the beef gave it enough salt and fat to feel like a proper meal. A head of cabbage cost almost nothing. A can of corned beef was a couple of dollars at most. Together, they fed 3 or 4 people with leftovers for the next day. You could eat it again the next night cold, straight from the refrigerator, and it tasted even better because the salt had worked its way deeper into the cabbage overnight. Seniors who grew up in row houses in Philadelphia and Baltimore and Boston ate this once a week as children and never stopped making it. Their mothers made it on paydays. Their grandmothers made it on any day. The recipe never changed because it never needed to. 1 can, half a cabbage, a pot of water, and enough patience to let it simmer. The taste was home. The price was survival. And the smell, that sweet, salty, cabbagey steam filling a small kitchen, was a signal to everyone in the house that dinner was ready and that someone still cared enough to make it. Ambrosia salad was the fluffy, sweet concoction that straddled the line between side dish and dessert, its marshmallows and coconut creating something uniquely American. Canned mandarin oranges, pineapple chunks, and maraschino cherries were folded with miniature marshmallows, shredded coconut, and sour cream. The mixture was chilled overnight, allowing flavors to meld and marshmallows to soften. Served in cut glass bowls, the pastel colors seemed appropriately festive. Children especially loved ambrosia, often requesting second helpings despite protests about ruining their appetite. The dish required no cooking, making it perfect for busy kitchens where oven space was precious. Some families added pecans or used cottage cheese, each variation reflecting regional preferences. Ambrosia has largely disappeared from Christmas tables, dismissed as too sweet and artificial, but for decades it was a beloved tradition that children anticipated all year. Number 23. Biscuits and sausage gravy. Homemade biscuits split open on a plate, covered in a thick white gravy made from breakfast sausage, pan drippings, flour, and milk. The gravy was peppery and rich, and the biscuits soaked it up like a sponge. In the rural South, this was dinner as often as it was breakfast. A tube of bulk sausage, a few cups of flour, and some milk gave you enough food to fill a full table for very little money. You browned the sausage, left the grease in the pan, whisked in the flour until it turned golden, then added the milk slowly until it thickened. Every family had their own ratio. None of them wrote it down. Eggs and milk, two of the most basic ingredients in any 1960s kitchen, were the foundation of a meal that felt more like a science experiment than dinner. Floating island dinner, as it was sometimes called, involved poaching eggs in a thin milk broth, then serving them over toast with a dusting of paprika. It was cheap, it was filling, and while it may have looked unusual, it made the most of what families had on hand. Eggs were a working-class staple, packed with protein and relatively inexpensive compared to meat. Poaching them in milk was a way to add richness without using butter or oil, and the broth itself didn't go to waste. It soaked into the toast, creating a soft, custard-like texture that was surprisingly satisfying. Paprika wasn't just for color. It added a hint of warmth and spice to an otherwise mild dish. This kind of meal had roots in old-fashioned frugality. Similar recipes had been around for generations, passed down from an era when every ingredient had to serve a purpose. For kids, it was a bit of a mystery. Why was dinner floating? But for parents, it was an easy, one-pan solution that turned a few simple staples into something warm and nourishing at the end of a long day. Number 24. Milk toast. This was the dinner you made when somebody was running a fever, or when the cupboard was almost bare, or when you simply did not have the energy to do anything else. 2 slices of bread, toasted just enough to hold their shape, laid flat in a shallow bowl. You heated milk on the stove with a pat of butter and a pinch of sugar, poured it warm over the toast, and ate it slowly with a spoon. In the 1940s and 1950s, milk toast was what mothers made for sick children and what widowed men ate alone at the kitchen table on quiet evenings. It cost almost nothing. It required almost nothing. And it was warm, and it was soft, and at the end of a long day, that was enough. Before I go further, for the folks who want meals like these all gathered in one place, I have put together the Vintage Recipe Guide, a collection of the recipes we keep coming back to on this channel, all at my website vintagelifestyleusa.com. I will not bring it up again in this video. If you want it, it is there. Now, back to the list. Number 8. Liver and onions with brown gravy. You sliced a pound of beef liver, dredged it in seasoned flour, and fried it in bacon grease 2 minutes aside. You pulled the liver out, cooked 2 sliced onions in the same pan until they were dark and sweet, then poured a cup of beef broth in to scrape up the brown bits and thicken the gravy with the leftover flour on the meat. Liver was the cheapest cut at the butcher counter for 65 years. It is full of iron and B12, which is why Depression-era doctors prescribed it for tired mothers and growing children. You ate it because it was free or close to it. You remember it because your grandmother soaked it in milk for an hour first, and that is the trick that made it tender. The second trick was the heat. You never cooked liver past medium. More than 2 minutes aside and it turned to leather. Pink in the middle, crisp outside, under dark, sweet onions. Molasses snow biscuits were the winter morning treat families depended on when cold wind rattled the windows and sugar was too expensive to use freely. Molasses poured slow like winter honey, thick and dark, stretching sweet flavor through dough that otherwise would have tasted plain. Grandma mixed flour, baking powder, lard, and just enough molasses to tint the dough the color of early morning shadows. She shaped them quickly, hands practiced, and placed them close together so they rose against one another like a small family huddled for warmth. When they baked, the kitchen filled with the deep scent of molasses that made the whole house feel less cold. These biscuits were soft inside, with a slight crust outside, the perfect thing to tear open and eat with butter if you had it or plain if you did not. They were born from practicality but tasted like comfort, proof that even the simplest ingredients could become something worth remembering. On winter mornings when the world outside felt frozen, these biscuits made the first hour of the day feel hopeful. They were not fancy, but they were dependable, and that meant everything. Molasses snow biscuits were the kind of food that stayed in families even when circumstances changed. whispered from one kitchen to another, because no cookbook ever bothered to capture their worth. Buttermilk cornbread baked in cast iron was the bread that appeared at every meal, made so often that Grandma's hands moved without thinking. She stirred cornmeal with buttermilk, added a beaten egg, a pinch of salt, a bit of baking soda, and just enough bacon grease to make it rich. The cast iron skillet sat heating in the oven, getting smoking hot before she poured in the batter, which sizzled dramatically against the greased surface. That hot skillet created the crispy bottom crust that distinguished real cornbread from the sweet cakey versions made by people who didn't know better. The bread baked until golden on top, then was flipped onto a plate and cut into wedges still steaming. This cornbread was meant for crumbling into beans, soaking up pot liquor, spreading with butter while still warm. Every grandmother's cornbread tasted slightly different. Some added sugar despite tradition, others kept it pure. But all of them made it without measuring, their hands knowing exactly what the batter should look like. Neck bones and rice was the Monday dinner in countless Southern households, a tradition born from economic necessity and perfected through generations of careful seasoning. Pork neck bones, sold cheap because they required work to eat, were browned in a deep skillet, their exposed marrow and cartilage promising richness no other cut could deliver. Onions, garlic, and seasonings joined before liquid was added, and the pot was covered for long simmering. When meat had loosened from bones and cooking liquid reduced to concentrated flavor, rice was stirred in to absorb every bit of goodness. The finished dish was eaten with fingers and spoons. Neck bones required picking, the meat hidden in crevices that rewarded patience. Children learned early that the sweetest meat lived closest to the bone. This dish cost almost nothing but fed families completely, the rice stretching rich pork flavor across plates that satisfied without requiring expensive cuts. Number 5. One-pan chicken and rice. Campbell's Test Kitchen created this recipe in the late 1940s. It was printed on soup can labels beginning in the early 1950s and became one of the most reproduced promotional recipes in American food history. One baking dish, chicken pieces laid over uncooked rice. 1 can of cream of chicken soup mixed with 1 can of water poured over everything. Salt, pepper, paprika. Cover with foil. Bake at 350 degrees for an hour and 15 minutes. The whole meal cost about $1.15. The recipe required almost no cooking skill. You poured, you arranged, you covered, you waited. The soup did everything. It steamed the rice. It braised the chicken. It made its own sauce. For a country full of young mothers with 3 children and a television set competing for their attention, that was exactly the kind of meal that kept a household running. Number 14. Swanson 3-course dinner. This was Swanson's attempt to make a frozen dinner feel like a proper sit-down meal. Instead of the standard tray with 3 compartments, the 3-course dinner came with a soup course, a main course, and a dessert. You got the works: a small foil cup of soup, the usual meat and vegetable center, and a piece of cake or cobbler in the 3rd section. Swanson introduced it in the early 1960s and advertised it as the frozen dinner for people who wanted more than a quick tray in front of the television. The packaging was fancier, the price was higher, the promise was ambitious, but the execution had problems no amount of advertising could fix. The soup came in a separate foil cup you heated alongside the main tray, which meant coordinating 2 items in the oven at 2 different heat levels. The soup was usually cream of something: cream of mushroom, cream of chicken, cream of tomato. It came out thin and salty but warm, and warmth counted for something. The dessert was a small square of apple cobbler or chocolate cake that dried out at the edges during the long oven time the main course demanded. The main course itself was identical to the regular Swanson dinner, just surrounded by more ambition. Families bought the 3-course version once or twice for the novelty, then went back to the standard tray because nobody wanted to scrub an extra soup cup for a meal that was supposed to eliminate dishes in the first place. Swanson quietly retired it. The idea was ahead of its time, or maybe exactly on time for a moment that passed quickly. Number 17. Glazed ham loaf with pineapple. A 2-pound loaf made from ground cured ham mixed with ground pork, bound with breadcrumbs and an egg, baked in a ring mold, crowned with Dole pineapple rings and brown sugar that caramelized in the last 20 minutes. Pennsylvania Dutch country invented it. Church suppers from York to Lancaster served it on long tables every other Sunday. Through the 1960s, butchers ground their ham trimmings into loaves wrapped in white paper and labeled by hand for housewives to take home for about $1 a pound. By 1985, most butcher counters had been replaced by plastic-wrapped meat in the cold case. The ham loaf went with them. The pineapple ring still shows up on the occasional Easter ham, but it is a ghost of a ghost. You will not find a butcher who grinds his own ham loaf mix in any chain grocery store today. So next we have ham with red wine and cinnamon glaze, which was a big part of the entire trend of pairing up alcohol with different kinds of glazes in food. The combination of sweet and savory was something that got Americans every time, and the depth of red wine was something everyone was a sucker for. Plus, it always worked super well with the taste of cinnamon. The thing is, these weren't the glazes that would make the long haul. Those would be brown sugar and honey glazes, and others with similar flavor profiles. The entire trend of adding alcohol to your dishes was something that people left behind because of several reasons, but mostly it required too much precision and work. Not everyone had the skill for that, and if they did, then they didn't have the time for it, and if they even had that, then it was probably on their off days where they didn't have the energy for it. Plus, the tastes here were definitely accepted into the mainstream, but the mainstream has dozens of things that are more familiar and easier to digest. The acidity in red wine is something that doesn't always go well with ham if you don't know what you're doing, and unless you were a chef in a French restaurant, you probably didn't have the best idea. Not to mention all the health risks of consuming alcohol regularly with your food. The can of corned beef hash told you nothing useful. Dense, brick red, smelling faintly of iron. Anyone meeting it for the first time would have reservations. The people who knew it understood one rule: put it in the skillet and leave it alone. Crumble in with diced onion, spread flat, press lightly, and abandon for 8 full minutes while a dark crust builds on the bottom. Turn once, one time only, let the other side catch. With an egg on top, it was a complete dinner for under a quarter. Armour was the standard, about 19 cents a can in the 1960s. The men who lived on it, the widowers, the newly divorced, the ones on a hot plate in a furnished room, would tell you it tasted fine. Some would tell you it tasted exactly like getting through the week. The egg on top was what made it worth sitting down for. Number 12. Treat and macaroni skillet. Treat was the other luncheon meat, the one that sat on the shelf next to Spam but cost a few cents less. You cubed it, fried it until the edges crisped, and tossed it with cooked elbow macaroni and a squeeze of ketchup or a splash of canned tomato sauce. The whole skillet came together in about 12 minutes. No oven, no baking dish, no waiting. Treat had a softer texture than Spam, almost like a firm pate, and it browned differently, more golden than crispy. Paired with macaroni, it made a one-pan dinner that required exactly 0 skill and generated exactly 1 dirty dish. Seniors on tight budgets bought Treat specifically because those few pennies mattered when you were counting every coin at the register. Roast duck with orange sauce was the continental-inspired dish that sophisticated families served to demonstrate their worldly tastes. The duck was pricked all over to release fat, then roasted slowly until the skin turned impossibly crisp while the meat stayed moist. Orange sauce was made from scratch, combining fresh juice, zest, stock, and sometimes Grand Marnier into something bright that balanced the rich meat. The presentation was classic. Sliced duck breast fanned across plates, sauce drizzled artfully, orange segments providing color. This was aspirational cooking, inspired by French restaurants and Julia Child's television appearances. Duck required more skill than turkey or chicken, its higher fat content demanding different techniques. The dish represented cultural ambition, families embracing international cuisine as a mark of sophistication. Today, duck rarely appears on home Christmas tables, reserved for restaurants where few experience its former holiday glory. Number 16. Chili con carne. Ground beef browned with diced onion, then a can of tomatoes, a can of kidney beans, chili powder, cumin, and salt. You let it simmer until the liquid cooked down and the flavors blended into something that smelled like fall. Some families served it over spaghetti noodles. Others ate it straight from the bowl with crackers crumbled on top. Chili was a one-pot meal that could feed a crowd, and in the 1950s it was standard fare in church basements, school cafeterias, and home kitchens across the country. The ingredient list was short and forgiving. You could leave out the beans, double the meat, or throw in whatever vegetables were about to turn soft in the crisper. Not every seafood dish came from the ocean. Some came straight from a can. In a time when fresh shrimp was a luxury for coastal towns, canned shrimp offered an affordable way for working-class families to bring a little seafood into their diets. Mixed with peas in a thick, creamy white sauce and served over crackers or toast, this dish had a playful name, Shrimp Wiggle. But it was all business when it came to stretching ingredients. Canned shrimp had been around since the early 20th century, marketed as a convenient alternative to fresh shellfish. By the 1960s, it found its way into all kinds of home-cooked meals, from salads to casseroles. In this dish, it was combined with a simple white sauce, a budget-friendly staple made from butter, flour, and milk that turned just about anything into a filling, stick-to-your-ribs meal. The peas added a pop of color and a bit of sweetness, balancing out the richness of the sauce. Served over saltines or toasted white bread, it wasn't fancy, but it was warm, comforting, and familiar. For many kids, it was their first introduction to seafood, whether they liked it or not. Some remember it fondly, while others never quite warmed up to the idea of shrimp that came from a can. Butterbean burgers were the quiet champions of the broke man's dinner table, turning pantry scraps into something worth savoring. You'd start with a can of butter beans, mash them until smooth, and mix in breadcrumbs, an egg, and a pinch of salt and pepper. When fried, the patties crisped up perfectly, the edges golden brown and the centers creamy like mashed potatoes. The beans brought a rich, earthy flavor that made you forget there wasn't any meat involved. You could serve them on bread with mustard, stack them like real burgers, or eat them straight from the skillet with a fork. They filled you up fast and cost next to nothing, a miracle in itself. Families loved how far one can could go, and kids didn't mind because they tasted good. It was one of those rare recipes that started from desperation but stayed for its flavor. Butterbean burgers proved that meat wasn't the only thing that made a meal feel whole. They were born from necessity but carried pride, the sound of sizzling oil marking another night conquered. Poverty taught people to adapt, but these burgers taught them to thrive. Number 12. Hoe cakes with sorghum. You whisked a cup of cornmeal, half a cup of buttermilk, a beaten egg, salt, and a tablespoon of bacon grease, and spooned it into hot cast iron in palm-sized rounds. The name comes from the iron blade of a garden hoe, which freed slaves and sharecroppers used as a griddle over an open fire when there was no proper pan in the cabin. The Cherokee taught it to the colonists. Black families in South Carolina made hoe cakes a quiet act of survival through the Jim Crow century. You eat them with sorghum poured straight on top. They cost pennies. They are, by every honest measure, ancestral food. The genius was the bacon grease in the batter itself. A tablespoon of rendered fat made the hoe cakes brown the way a real pancake brown does, and the salt from the cured pork seasoned the corn from the inside. Without the grease, the cakes were chalky. With it, they tasted like the breakfast stove. Cane syrup ginger cookies were the winter sweets born from necessity, shaped by families who could not afford refined sugar but still wanted something warm and comforting. Cane syrup was cheaper, accessible, and kept well through the cold months, making it a trusted companion in countless kitchens. Grandma mixed it with flour, fat, and ground ginger, creating a soft dough that smelled like holiday spice even on ordinary afternoons. When the cookies baked, they spread into soft, chewy circles with edges that crisped just enough to snap gently under your teeth. The flavor was deep, warm, and earthy, the kind of sweetness that lingered rather than shouted. Families cherished these cookies because they brought joy without requiring ingredients that winter budgets could not handle. They tasted like generosity in lean times, a reminder that sweetness did not need to be extravagant to matter. Cane syrup ginger cookies were humble but powerful, a dessert that made cold days feel kinder. Leather britches and fatback was a winter survival dish that turned summer's green bean abundance into cold weather sustenance. Grandma would string fresh green beans on heavy thread during peak harvest, creating long garlands that hung from kitchen rafters to dry for weeks. By winter, these shriveled brown strips rattled like old leather when touched, giving them their peculiar name. To prepare them, she soaked handfuls overnight, then simmered them for hours with salted fatback that slowly melted its richness into the pot. The beans softened into something entirely different from fresh ones, chewy, concentrated, with a deep, earthy flavor that no canned vegetable could match. This dish required no measuring, just the knowledge of how much water to add and when the beans had reached the right tenderness. Families relied on leather britches when snow-covered gardens, and fresh vegetables existed only in memory. It was peasant food that tasted like Providence, requiring only patience and the accumulated wisdom of generations. Dutch oven possum and sweet potatoes represented Appalachian cooking at its most resourceful. Possums trapped in late autumn, fattened on persimmons and acorns, gave their meat a sweetness that surprised the unfamiliar. The cleaned animal was parboiled to remove gaminess, then placed in a large Dutch oven surrounded by quartered sweet potatoes and onions. A mixture of bacon fat, molasses, and vinegar was brushed over everything before the heavy lid was sealed and the pot nestled into fireplace coals. Hours of slow roasting transformed possum into fork-tender meat, while sweet potatoes absorbed rich cooking juices, becoming almost candied. This wasn't desperation food. It was celebration food in communities where possums were plentiful and store-bought meat was not. The Dutch oven made it possible to cook an entire meal with no attention beyond occasionally rotating the pot. Families served it for special occasions, proud of the skill required to prepare it properly. Pineapple Bavarian cream salad belonged to the family of molded desserts that were once considered the height of elegance in American dining. Housewives would prepare a gelatin base flavored with pineapple juice, fold in whipped cream, and let it set in decorative molds that made it look far fancier than the effort required. The result was a creamy, sweet dish that struck a perfect balance between richness and lightness, often served at luncheons or holiday dinners. Its exotic touch came from the pineapple, which in mid-century America still carried connotations of tropical luxury. Recipes often encouraged garnishing with extra fruit or whipped cream, making it as much a visual centerpiece as a dessert. Cookbooks from the 1950s and 60s frequently praised Bavarian creams for their versatility, and pineapple was a particularly popular version because it paired well with both sweet and savory menus. Today, the idea of molded cream salads feels dated, but in their time they were treasured recipes that signaled hospitality, sophistication, and an eagerness to impress guests with something beautiful and sweet. Number 17. Swanson macaroni and cheese dinner. This was the one kids asked for by name. A tray with a compartment of elbow macaroni in orange cheese sauce, usually next to a vegetable nobody touched, and sometimes a small brownie or fruit cobbler in the dessert slot. The cheese sauce came out of the oven, bubbling around the edges and lukewarm in the center, no matter how long you cooked it. Swanson's version was thicker and creamier than Morton's, and kids knew the difference. It was not Kraft, and it was not homemade, and it lived somewhere in between where most frozen food made its home. Swanson eventually dropped this dinner as the brand shifted toward adult-oriented meals. The kids who loved it grew up and forgot it existed until right now. Number 19. Salisbury steak TV dinner. 1 ground beef patty in dark brown gravy, a scoop of mashed potatoes, a square of corn, and a brownie compartment sealed in an aluminum tray and slid into a Swanson box. Swanson introduced its Salisbury steak dinner in 1962. By the middle of the decade, frozen TV dinners were on the menu in millions of American homes once or twice a week, eaten on metal trays in front of Bonanza or The Ed Sullivan Show. Families stopped trying to make Salisbury steak from scratch because the frozen one came out the same every time. The homemade version, a Wednesday night patty smothered in mushroom gravy, faded inside 10 years. When TV dinners faded in the 1980s, the dish faded with them. The brownie compartment was the first thing the kids ate and the last thing anyone remembers. You can still buy a Salisbury steak frozen dinner today, but the gravy tastes like a copy of a copy. Lobster mornay actually refers to this French cheese sauce, which is considered mostly a variation of bechamel, which has become incredibly popular in America. It was considered one of the elites of the sauce scene back then, and it was actually named after a 16th century French diplomat. Apparently, Philippe de Mornay first found out how to make this when he added cheese to the ever-so-classic bechamel sauce, and as a result, we had lobster mornay. It's always been a big thing in coastal cities and places with a strong fishing industry here, especially since lobster being expensive was only relatively a new thing. Unfortunately, that's exactly where things went wrong for this dish. Lobsters are now a luxury item, thanks to industrialized fishing. They aren't the cheap and accessible catch of the day anymore that people are used to. And honestly, since they're a very irregular meal to have during the holidays, people are a lot more selective with what they do with their lobster now. All that combined with tastes going further away from what Mornay sauce had to offer meant it couldn't last the long haul. Potato soup asked nothing and gave back more than seemed fair. 2 potatoes, 1 onion, water to cover, salt, 20 minutes on the back burner. When the potatoes softened, you added milk, butter, a heavy grind of black pepper. The move no cookbook explained well. Mash a few pieces against the side of the pot while leaving the rest in chunks, so the broth thickened without going smooth, and every spoonful had something to bite. It cost under 20 cents in the early 1960s. It was the soup of people living alone after something, a divorce, a death, a child who left and took all the noise. You made it because it filled the kitchen with a plain, honest smell and fed you without requiring thought. She made it every winter. You knew that version by heart, the way she never once measured the milk. The version you make now is close. Every time you sit down alone with it, close is not the same thing. Number 25, Spam and Egg Skillet. You sliced the Spam thin, maybe a 1/4 inch, and laid each piece flat in a hot skillet with a little butter. You let it crisp until the edges went golden and almost crunchy. Then you cracked 2 eggs right beside it and fried them in the rendered fat. Salt, pepper, a slice of toast if you had bread. That was the whole production. 1 can of Spam stretched across 3 meals if you were careful. Breakfast, lunch, and then a fried Spam sandwich at the end of the day. But when money was truly gone and the refrigerator had nothing else in it, this became dinner. Hot, filling, and nobody at the table pretended it was anything other than what it was. You ate it, and you were grateful. Waldorf salad was the crisp, creamy combination that brought elegance to Christmas tables. It's apples, celery, and walnuts dressed in mayonnaise and served on lettuce cups. Created at New York's Waldorf Astoria Hotel, the salad spread to home kitchens where it became synonymous with refined holiday dining. The apples were diced small, their tartness balanced by creamy mayonnaise and crunchy walnuts. Some cooks added grapes or raisins for extra sweetness, while others kept it simple. The salad was served on beds of iceberg lettuce, its pale colors looking sophisticated against the green. Making Waldorf salad required careful timing. The apples would brown if prepared too early, so it was often made just before serving. The dish represented the era's fascination with hotel cuisine, when recreating restaurant dishes at home was a mark of sophistication. Waldorf salad has largely vanished from Christmas tables, replaced by green salads that seem lighter and more modern. Number 20. Fried bologna with mashed potatoes. A thick slice of bologna scored around the edges so it would not curl, fried in a dry skillet until the outside blistered and browned. Serve it on a plate next to a pile of mashed potatoes made from real potatoes, butter, and milk. This was a working-class dinner that showed up in lunchbox towns and factory cities across the Rust Belt and the Ohio Valley. Bologna was one of the cheapest deli meats you could buy, and frying it changed the texture completely. The outside got crispy and a little smoky. The inside stayed soft. Mashed potatoes turned it into a plate that looked and felt complete. No one bragged about serving it. Everyone cleaned their plate. There was a time when dinner didn't come from a drive-thru or a frozen box. It came from whatever was on hand. In kitchens where budgets were tight and grocery trips were limited, a humble combination of eggs, milk, flour, and butter could transform into something that filled bellies without emptying wallets. So how was egg sauce on saltines made? Hard-boiled eggs were mashed into a simple white sauce, thickened just enough to spoon over a stack of saltine crackers. It wasn't glamorous, but it got the job done. Eggs were a working-class staple, packed with protein and cheap enough to buy by the dozen. A basic white sauce, made from milk, flour, and butter, was the foundation of countless Depression-era and post-war meals, stretching ingredients without overpowering them. Crackers? Those were always in the pantry, whether for soup, snacks, or in this case, an entire meal. Families who couldn't afford fresh bread every day turned to saltines as a substitute, their crisp texture adding just enough bite to an otherwise soft dish. It may not have been the most exciting dinner, but it was warm, filling, and familiar. Kids ate it without fuss. Parents appreciated how far it stretched, and for those who grew up on it, the taste is forever linked to simpler times. Number 7. Rice and pan drippings. A cup of long-grain white rice cooked on the stove, topped with the saved drippings from whatever meat you fried the night before. Bacon grease, sausage fat, the rendered drippings from a pork chop. You spooned it hot over the rice and stirred until every grain was coated and glistening. In the rural South, rice and drippings showed up on the table at least once a week, and the women who made it kept a coffee can of saved grease on the back of the stove the way other families kept a sugar bowl on the counter. It sounds plain because it was plain. But the fat carried a depth of flavor that no store-bought seasoning could touch, and a bowl of it on a cold evening in January settled something deep and quiet in your chest. Number 21. Hamburger gravy on toast. You browned half a pound of ground beef in cast iron, sprinkled 3 tablespoons of flour into the grease, stirred a minute, then poured in 2 cups of milk and thickened it. You poured the gray, peppery gravy over toast. 30 cents fed 4 in 1962. The Navy called it SOS for short, which stood for 2 words your grandmother would not say out loud. The dish first appeared in the 1910 Manual for Army Cooks and fed soldiers from World War I through Vietnam. The trick is, the flour cooks in the beef fat for a full minute before the milk goes in. That kills the raw taste. Your father did it without thinking. What most people miss is that the bread mattered as much as the gravy. White toast was wrong. You wanted Wonder Bread 3 days stale because the dry crumbs soaked the gravy without going to mush. Hominy and bacon casserole offered hearty satisfaction with minimal ingredients, highlighting how resourcefulness defined many mid-century meals. Creamy canned hominy provided a naturally sweet base that absorbed the smoky flavor of crisp bacon bits sprinkled throughout. A light sauce of milk and butter bound everything together before baking, creating a dish with comforting richness despite its simplicity. Families often served it as a main course with a side of green vegetables or a slice of cornbread, making it a complete and inexpensive dinner. Hominy's long shelf life and low price made it a dependable pantry staple, while just a few strips of bacon added enough depth to please meat lovers without straining the budget. The casserole reheated beautifully, so leftovers were welcomed for quick lunches the next day. Its combination of smooth texture and smoky taste made it popular at potlucks and church gatherings where thrifty recipes were always appreciated. Hominy and bacon casserole remains a testament to how modest ingredients can deliver true comfort and memorable flavor when prepared with care and creativity. Wilted lettuce with hot bacon dressing transformed garden greens into something entirely different from cold salad. Grandma would fry thick-cut bacon until crispy, then remove it and pour a splash of cider vinegar into the sizzling hot grease. The mixture would pop and sputter dangerously, filling the kitchen with sharp, smoky fragrance. She added a pinch of sugar by feel, stirred quickly, then poured the hot dressing over a bowl of tender leaf lettuce just picked from the garden. The leaves wilted immediately, becoming silky and infused with bacon flavor while still retaining some fresh crunch. The crumbled bacon was scattered on top, sometimes with sliced hard-boiled eggs. This dish existed only in spring when lettuce was young and tender, before summer heat turned it bitter. Grandma made it entirely by instinct, How much vinegar depended on how tart she wanted it. How much sugar on the lettuce's bitterness that day. The salad was eaten immediately while still warm, a fleeting pleasure that couldn't be saved. Venison liver hash was the hunter's breakfast that turned organ meat into morning fuel for another day in the woods. Fresh deer liver, prized by those who knew its value, was sliced thin and fried quickly in bacon fat alongside diced potatoes and onions. The liver cooked fast, staying pink inside while developing a caramelized exterior that added depth to the hash. The potatoes absorbed the rich mineral flavor of the liver, while the onions provided sweetness to balance the meat's intensity. For families who hunted their own meat, liver was the first reward of a successful hunt, eaten fresh, while the rest of the deer was processed and preserved. Nothing from the animal went to waste, and the liver provided iron and nutrients that would sustain another day of hard work. The hash came together in one skillet in under 20 minutes, feeding hungry hunters before dawn broke over the mountains. This was practical eating that happened to be genuinely delicious. Seafoam salad was a light and airy dish that brought together flavors and textures in a way that fascinated mid-century cooks. Using lime jello as a base, it combined cream cheese, whipped cream, and crushed pears into a frothy, fluffy creation that almost melted in the mouth. Its pale green color gave it an ethereal quality, leading to its whimsical name. This was the kind of recipe that felt special without being difficult, perfect for bridge club luncheons, bridal showers, or summer gatherings. Its sweetness was balanced by the slight tang of the cream cheese, creating a dish that was more sophisticated than many other gelatin salads of the time. The combination of canned pears and packaged gelatin made it easy to assemble quickly, which was a major draw for busy homemakers. Though few people make seafoam salad today, it stands as an example of the playful experimentation that defined American cooking in the 1950s and 60s, when presentation and creativity mattered as much as practicality. Number 24. Morton Spaghetti and Meatballs Dinner. Morton was the budget brand, and this tray proved it. Thin spaghetti in a watery tomato sauce with 3 small meatballs that were more breadcrumb than beef. The side was usually a square of garlic bread that came out of the oven either rock hard or soggy, never anything in between. Morton sold these for less than Swanson, and families on tight budgets stacked them deep in the chest freezer. The sauce left an orange ring on the aluminum that no amount of scrubbing could remove. Kids loved it because it was spaghetti they could eat in front of the television without their mother hovering. Parents loved it because it cost less than a pound of ground beef. Before I go further, for the folks who want more old recipes like these all in one place, I put together the Vintage Recipe Guide. It is a collection of forgotten recipes you will not find in any store. You can find it on my website, vintagelifestyleusa.com. I will not bring it up again. If you want it, it is there. Now, back to the list. Number 25, Tomato Aspic Salad. A ring of tomato juice, gelatin, and finely chopped celery, unmolded onto an iceberg leaf with a dollop of Hellmann's mayonnaise dropped in the center. Hostesses called it a salad because it was cold and it jiggled. It first appeared on suburban dinner tables in the late 1950s and held its place through the early 1960s as the marker that a housewife could afford a refrigerator and the time it took to chill 3 layers. Imagine a copper ring mold sweating in a Frigidaire next to a glass dish of deviled eggs. The Jell-O brand even sold a seasoned tomato flavor in the 1960s, packaged for exactly this dish at 23 cents a box. By 1968, Better Homes started running fewer molded salads and more crisp greens, and the aspic ring slid quietly out of the dinner party rotation. Today, nobody under 60 has tasted one. The dish belongs to the era when sophistication was measured by how cleanly something slid out of a copper mold. Roasted duck with orange bourbon molasses glaze was something that was always synonymous with haute cuisine and fine dining. It was an indulgent and luxurious meal, something you'd really get if you were trying to pull out all the stops. Maybe you were celebrating a win, a holiday, or maybe you just wanted to leave a good impression on your partner. Either way, whenever you wanted to swoop someone off their feet, this is what you would go for. That orange glaze has French roots, but when you put an American spin on it with bourbon and molasses, you get a very warm and southern sauce that has a lot of caramel notes mixed in, along with a very vivid sweetness. Sounds pretty lovely, right? So why'd it die? The thing is, this was popular around the same time one-pot meals were becoming a thing. People started to abandon dishes like that, which just took an extreme amount of work and a lot of complexity. You had to roast the duck, then you had to make the special glaze, and you had to do all of that just right or it wouldn't work. On the other hand, one-pot meals were time-efficient, better for a family, and a lot more simple to make. The smell of salmon patties hit you before you were fully inside, warm and oceanic, meaning someone was making something out of nothing. Canned pink salmon, bones left in because they were soft enough to eat, and every mother insisted they were good for you, got flaked with crumbled saltines, 1 egg, a spoonful of yellow mustard, and dried onion flakes. Shaped with wet hands into a skillet where Crisco was already shimmering. 2 minutes aside, 3 if you wanted the crust darker. The outside turned copper penny brown. The inside stayed barely warm at center. Tartar sauce if you had it, ketchup if you didn't. A whole generation kept a can of salmon in the back of the cabinet the way they kept a $20 bill in a shoe. Not for every day, but for when everything ran out. Canned salmon cost under 40 cents in the early 1960s. The patties made from it tasted like a cook who knew what to do with 40 cents. Most of those cooks are gone now, and the cans in the back of the cabinet have been gathering dust. Number 18. Spam fried rice. You cooked a pot of white rice the day before and left it in the refrigerator overnight so the grains dried out and separated. The next evening, you diced half a can of Spam into small cubes, fried them in a hot wok or skillet until the outsides crisped, pushed them to the side, scrambled an egg in the open space, and then tossed in the cold rice with a few shakes of soy sauce. Stirred it all together over high heat until the rice picked up a faint char on the bottom. If you had a green onion, you sliced it thin on top. This was a meal that came to the mainland with military families who had been stationed in Hawaii and the Pacific. It traveled well because the ingredients traveled well. A bag of rice, a can of Spam, an egg, and a bottle of soy sauce could sit in any kitchen for months. Jellied cranberry mold was the shimmering ruby centerpiece that wiggled its way onto holiday tables, its rings and fluted shapes announcing Christmas had arrived. Cranberry juice was combined with gelatin, sugar, and sometimes chopped celery, walnuts, or orange zest before being poured into decorative molds and chilled until firm. Unmolding required skill and courage, a moment of tension as the gelatin released from its container onto the serving platter. The most elaborate molds created rings, stars, or Christmas tree shapes that drew admiration before the first slice was cut. The flavor was tart-sweet, the texture somewhere between firm and wobbly that either delighted or disturbed guests. Families served cranberry mold alongside turkey and stuffing, its bright color providing contrast to brown and beige. The canned cranberry sauce that replaced it never achieved the same festive presentation. Jellied molds of all kinds have disappeared from modern tables, taking with them an era when presentation required skill and patience. Number 25. Stewed tomatoes on toast. A can of whole tomatoes poured into a saucepan with a spoonful of butter, a pinch of sugar and salt. You let them simmer until they broke apart into a thick, chunky sauce, then spooned them over slices of toasted bread. The toast soaked up the juice and turned soft underneath while the edges stayed firm enough to hold. This was a supper that Catholic families made on Fridays, and penny-pinching households made any night the meat ran out. Some cooks stirred in a beaten egg at the end to stretch it further. Others tore the bread into pieces and let it cook right in the pot. It looked like nothing on the plate, but it tasted like a garden in August, and it cost so little that nobody ever thought to write the recipe down. Scrapple was traditionally a way to use up leftover pork scraps, but when meat was scarce or too expensive, another version took its place, one that relied on sweet potatoes and cornmeal instead. Sweet potato scrapple kept the same fried, crispy on the outside, soft on the inside texture, but swapped out meat for mashed sweet potatoes, mixed with cornmeal and spices, then molded into a loaf and sliced before frying. It was simple, cheap, and packed with enough flavor to make you forget there wasn't any pork in sight. Sweet potatoes were a southern staple, affordable, nutritious, and easy to grow. Unlike white potatoes, they had a natural sweetness that made them versatile in both savory and sweet dishes. Combined with cornmeal, another low-cost kitchen essential, they created a filling, hearty meal that could be eaten on its own or served with eggs for breakfast. Seasonings varied by household. Some added cinnamon for warmth, others leaned into salt and pepper for a more savory bite. Families who grew up eating it remember the unmistakable sound of slices sizzling in a hot pan, the edges crisping up to golden perfection. Number 5. Chicken fried steak. Cube steak, the cheapest cut of beef on the shelf, pounded flat with a meat mallet and coated in seasoned flour, dipped in beaten egg and coated again. You fried it in a half-inch of vegetable oil until the crust turned golden and shattered when you pressed a fork through it. The white cream gravy came right behind, built in the same pan from the leftover flour and drippings with whole milk stirred in until it went thick and smooth. Chicken fried steak was born in Texas, raised by German and Czech immigrants who carried schnitzel traditions into cattle country, and by the 1950s it had taken hold in every diner and kitchen from Oklahoma to Alabama. The steak cost almost nothing because cube steak was the cut no one else wanted. The breading did the work of making it feel like a meal worth sitting down for. Number 24. Depression spaghetti. You opened a bottle of ketchup and you opened a box of pasta, and that was the entire grocery list. The home cooks of the 1930s figured out that sugar, vinegar, and tomato puree were the three things that made marinara taste like marinara, and ketchup already had all three. You boiled the noodles, drained them, stirred in half a bottle of ketchup, and you had a plate that looked like Italian food on a budget that did not. A Japanese chef in 1945 watched American GIs eat C-ration spaghetti and invented Napolitan, still on Tokyo menus today. Down in Haiti, they make breakfast spaghetti with ketchup, sausage, and pepper. One cheap idea, 3 countries, all feeding workers. The bare-bones version fed millions across 2 decades. Evaporated and powdered milk were the quiet heroes of the poor man's pantry, the kind that didn't look like much but made all the difference. When fresh milk was too expensive or too far to fetch, these tins stepped in. Powdered milk mixed with water could be used for baking, breakfast, and even feeding babies when nothing else was around. Evaporated milk had that thick, sweet flavor that made coffee richer and pies creamier. It was comfort in a can. People learned to trust it because it never spoiled and could sit on a shelf for months. During lean winters, that security meant everything. You'd see families mix a little milk powder with oats, stretch it into gravy, or stir it into mashed potatoes. It might not have been the farm fresh kind, but it carried the same warmth. For many, those tins meant nourishment and dignity in a time when both were scarce. Poke salad with eggs was the dangerous spring tonic that required knowledge passed only through careful teaching. Pokeweed grew wild along fence rows, its young shoots emerging as the first spring greens when bodies starved for fresh vitamins after winter. But poke was poisonous if prepared wrong. Grandma knew to pick only the youngest shoots, boil them in at least 2 changes of water to remove toxins, then drain and fry them in bacon grease. She scrambled eggs directly into the cooked greens, the yolks enriching what would otherwise be bitter and medicinal. No cookbook ever included proper poke preparation because the knowledge was too dangerous for inexperienced readers. You had to learn which plants were young enough, how many water changes were truly necessary, when the greens were safe. This dish represented the ultimate grandmother knowledge, survival wisdom that could feed you or kill you depending on expertise that existed only in the hands of those who learned it young. Salmon croquettes and fried potatoes was the Friday night dinner that stretched a single can of fish into a meal for the whole family. Canned salmon, bones, skin, and all, was mashed with egg, cracker crumbs, and onion, then formed into patties that fried in cast iron until golden and crispy outside while staying moist within. The same skillet held sliced potatoes that cooked in the remaining oil, absorbing the salmon's richness while developing caramelized edges. For Catholic families observing meatless Fridays, this was the answer that satisfied without breaking religious rules or household budgets. Canned salmon cost pennies and kept indefinitely on pantry shelves making it reliable protein that didn't require refrigeration. The croquettes were served hot from the skillet alongside the potatoes, often with a squeeze of lemon or splash of hot sauce. Children who grew up with this dish remember the satisfying crunch giving way to tender, flavorful fish inside. One can, one skillet, and everyone ate well. Pink fluff salad was a pastel favorite that appeared on countless tables during the heyday of gelatin desserts and whipped topping concoctions. Typically made with strawberry jello, whipped topping, and cottage cheese, it created a light and creamy dish that blurred the line between side and dessert. Marshmallows or canned fruit were often folded in to give it extra sweetness and texture, making it appealing to both children and adults. It was a dish that felt celebratory, perfect for holidays, showers, or community dinners where colorful food was part of the fun. Homemakers liked pink fluff salad because it was inexpensive, easy to prepare, and guaranteed to look cheerful on the table. Its soft texture and bright color made it a favorite among children, while its creamy sweetness gave adults a dose of comfort. Though it has largely disappeared from modern recipe collections, pink fluff salad remains a nostalgic reminder of the playful, creative cooking style that defined mid-century potlucks and family gatherings. Number 22. Patio Mexican Dinner. Before Tex-Mex restaurants spread across the country, patio foods gave the freezer aisle its first taste of enchiladas, tamales, and refried beans. The tray came with a small enchilada rolled tight in a corn tortilla, a tamale still in its husk, Spanish rice, and a compartment of refried beans that looked exactly like brown paste. Patio was based in San Antonio and marketed these dinners as authentic Mexican food for the American table. The enchilada was mild enough that it would not scare anyone in Ohio. The tamale was small but decent. The whole tray gave suburban families permission to feel adventurous on a Wednesday night without leaving the kitchen. Patio eventually got absorbed by larger companies, and the original dinner disappeared from freezers entirely. Number 20. Tuna Noodle Casserole. A can of chicken of the sea, a can of Campbell's cream of mushroom soup, a bag of egg noodles, a handful of frozen peas, and a crushed potato chip topping baked until the edges browned. A 1959 Federal Fisheries survey found that 8 out of 10 American households served canned tuna once a week, and the casserole sat at the top of that list. Through the 1960s, it was the dish a working mother slid into the oven before she changed out of her work clothes. The whole thing cost about 90 cents and fed 5. Picture the smell of cream of mushroom hitting the egg noodles in a galley kitchen in Wichita on a Tuesday in 1966. It survives in church potlucks but rarely on weeknight tables. The frozen peas have been replaced by takeout, the noodles by penny, and the casserole by nothing in particular. The recipe is still on the back of the Campbell's can. Almost nobody reads the back of the can anymore. So where do we start when it comes to the wild boar's head? This thing once used to be the very definition of luxury, especially during medieval and Renaissance times, and in recent memory, even Christmas feasts. It went from enjoying a place like that in people's diets to largely just vanishing from the state of modern dining and the culture as a whole. There are a few reasons, of course, since nothing ever really happens without one. The thing with the wild boar's head was that there were some health concerns surrounding it. Apparently, the meat of the boar can carry a disease known as trichinosis. It made it a lot harder to consume the meat. But that wasn't the final nail in the coffin. Whether it was the cultural shift towards roast turkey or just how hard this was to prepare, somewhere along the way, America fell out of love with the idea of a wild boar's head. Welsh rarebit, the name that made it sound like it required a hunting license, was sharp cheddar melted with Worcestershire sauce, dry mustard, and a splash of dark beer or milk poured over toast. The dish had been an English tavern staple since the 18th century, appearing in cookbooks as Welsh rabbit as early as 1725, and crossed into American kitchens as a dignified supper for the person who had cheese, bread, and little else. In the 1960s, it still appeared in Good Housekeeping as a savory, sophisticated but cheap. The trick nobody figured out alone. Heat had to stay low and the cheese stirred constantly, never boiling, or the sauce broke into a greasy slick and a rubbery lump. You learned this once by ruining it. Then you never forgot the temperature. The people who made rarebit well had been shown at the stove by someone who'd also been shown, the recipe passing hand to hand, not page to page, until the line of hands ran out and the dish quietly stopped showing up on Tuesday nights. There was no announcement. It just stopped. Number 20. Deviled ham on toast. That little Underwood can with the red devil on the label. You peeled back the lid, spread the ham thick on a piece of white toast, maybe added a squirt of yellow mustard or a thin slice of raw onion, and called it dinner. The deviled ham was salty, smooth, and packed with enough seasoning to carry plain bread without complaint. 2 cans and 4 slices of toast made a full meal. Some people ran it under the broiler for a minute to warm the top, but most ate it cold because the point was speed, not presentation. Seniors who lived alone ate this standing at the counter more often than they would ever admit. No plate, no napkin, just toast in hand and the can on the counter with the fork still in it. Stuffed Cornish game hens were the elegant individual servings that made every guest feel specially honored at Christmas dinner. These small birds, each just large enough for one person, were stuffed with wild rice, dried fruit, and nuts before roasting to golden perfection. The presentation was stunning, each guest receiving their own whole bird, its skin crackling and its cavity overflowing with aromatic stuffing. Carving was unnecessary. Diners simply cut into their personal hen, the juices pooling on the plate. Families who served Cornish hens were making a statement about sophistication and abundance, providing individual birds rather than slicing from a shared roast. The hens were often glazed with orange or apricot preserves, adding sweetness and shine. This dish represented the era's fascination with elevated home entertaining when suburban hostesses aspired to elegance. Cornish hens have largely disappeared from Christmas tables, replaced by simpler preparations. Number 27. Tomato soup and grilled cheese. A can of Campbell's tomato soup mixed with milk, heated on the stove. 2 slices of white bread with American cheese pressed flat in a buttered skillet until the bread turned brown and the cheese pulled in strings. This was not a side dish. For millions of families in the 1950s, this was Tuesday night supper. The soup ran hot and tangy, and the sandwich carried enough richness to make the whole meal feel complete. Diners served the same pairing for more money, but most people made it at home because there was nothing to get wrong. You needed a can, a loaf, and a few slices of cheese, and everybody at the table ate. In working-class kitchens, the best meals weren't always planned. They were thrown together with whatever was available. A pound of ground beef, a can of tomatoes, some diced potatoes, and a handful of elbow macaroni could turn into a thick, hearty stew that stuck to your ribs and stretched across multiple meals. Some called it slumgullion, others just called it dinner. Dishes like this had no strict recipe, just a basic formula, cheap, filling, and endlessly adaptable. One night it might be heavy on potatoes, the next, macaroni took center stage. Some families added onions for flavor, while others bulked it up with beans or whatever vegetables were left in the fridge. The name slumgullion had been around since the 1800s, used by miners and sailors to describe a hodgepodge meal, proof that resourceful cooking had always been part of survival. Ground beef was one of the most affordable proteins in the 1960s, and canned tomatoes provided flavor without the cost of fresh produce. With a simple pot and a little seasoning, this one-dish meal fed entire families with ease. It was the kind of food that tasted even better the next day, reheated on the stove after a long shift or a day at school. Comfort food without the price tag. Molasses jugs were the sweetness in a bitter life. Cheap and long-lasting, molasses could turn the plainest meal into something special. You could drizzle it on cornbread, stir it into beans, or mix it with hot water for a makeshift tea. It had a deep, smoky sweetness that tasted like comfort itself. Poor families loved it because it was cheaper than sugar and lasted 10 times longer. A single jug could see a household through months of tight times. Kids dipped biscuits in it, farmers used it to sweeten their coffee, and mothers poured it into cakes when they wanted to feel fancy. That thick, dark syrup was more than food. It was memory in liquid form. When money was thin and cupboards nearly bare, Molasses was the one indulgence you could still afford. It reminded people that joy could still exist in small, sticky spoons. Number 11. Cornmeal mush fried in lard. You stirred a cup of yellow cornmeal into 4 cups of boiling salted water, cooked it 15 minutes until it pulled from the sides, poured it into a loaf pan, and cooled it overnight in the icebox. The next morning, you sliced it 1/2 inch thick, fried the slices in a tablespoon of lard until the outside was a dark mahogany crust, and ate them with butter, sorghum, or a fried egg on top. Your grandfather grew up on this in Pennsylvania Dutch country in the 1920s, and so did half of the Midwest. 1 pound of cornmeal cost 6 cents in 1932 and fed 6 for 2 days. The genius is the pause. You cook it once and eat it 3 different ways across 2 days. Fewer dishes, less wood, more meals. And the cooling step was non-negotiable. A warm slab turned to pudding. A cold one held its shape like a Tuscan polenta cake. Mock banana pudding was the sort of dish that showed just how inventive Depression-era cooks could be when real ingredients were simply out of reach. Bananas, once imported luxuries, quickly became too expensive for families to buy. To make up for it, people leaned on banana extract, which could be purchased cheaply and used sparingly to add flavor, layered with homemade custard, when eggs and milk could be spared, and stacked between vanilla wafers or leftover bits of stale cake. The pudding felt surprisingly close to the original. Families would chill it in an icebox if they had one, though often it was served warm right from the stove. For children, it was a rare treat that offered the illusion of a fruit dessert, even if no fresh fruit was present. In many homes, mock banana pudding became a stand-in for celebration desserts, stretching scarce supplies into something families could still enjoy together, and for many, it carried the sweetness of hope itself. Fried pork chops and sawmill gravy was the meal that stretched 2 chops into dinner for 6 when money was tight, but appetites were large. Grandma would pound the chops thin, dredge them in seasoned flour, and fry them in lard until the coating turned crispy and the meat cooked through. The chops were set aside while she worked the pan drippings into gravy, adding flour and stirring until it browned, then pouring in milk slowly while scraping up all the flavorful bits stuck to the iron. The gravy thickened into something creamy and rich, flecked with brown bits of fried coating, poured over everything on the plate. Biscuits soaked it up, potatoes swam in it, and the pork chops got a final drench before eating. This was the meal that taught children to fill up on gravy and bread so the meat could stretch further. Grandma knew exactly how thick to make the gravy, how much milk to add, when to stop stirring, all without measuring a single ingredient. Skillet ham and red-eye gravy was the kind of breakfast for dinner that kept farming families going through long winter evenings. Country ham, salt-cured and hung in smokehouses for months, was sliced thick and fried in cast iron until the fat rendered and edges turned crispy and caramelized. The magic happened after the ham was set aside. Black coffee was poured directly into the hot skillet, sizzling against the rendered fat and browned bits clinging to the iron. This created red-eye gravy, named for the reddish eye that formed when coffee and fat separated. The gravy was thin, intensely salty, and slightly bitter, meant to be soaked up with biscuits or spooned over grits. For families who raised their own hogs and cured their own meat, this dish cost almost nothing beyond the coffee. The entire meal came together in under 15 minutes, leaving nothing but satisfaction and a well-seasoned skillet behind. One-pan sausage pasta is a name you would never have heard just a few decades before. But now it brings together the best of Italian comfort cooking and American convenience culture to make one incredibly satisfying dish. We've all been there, right? Days where pasta could cure us, but the effort seems way too much for the amount of gas we have left in the tank? That's when recipes like these come in handy. All of the pasta and meat cooked together, so the noodles don't ever feel disproportionately flavored. Every strand of noodle is infused with the taste of the sausage. The slow cooking really helps break down the fats, and what you get is something that tastes way more dense flavor-wise than anything else. Number 23, Chun King Chow Main Dinner. This was most of America's first introduction to anything remotely Chinese, and it came in a divided aluminum tray with crunchy chow mein noodles on one side and a mix of bean sprouts, celery, and mystery meat in brown sauce on the other. Geno Palucci built the Chun King brand out of Hibbing, Minnesota, about as far from China as a person could get. The frozen dinner version hit shelves in the late 1950s and stayed through the 1960s. The noodles were the best part. They came out crispy if you followed the oven directions and rubbery if you rushed it. For most families in small-town America, this tray was the entire Chinese food experience until a takeout place opened nearby. The brand changed hands multiple times, and the frozen dinner line quietly vanished. Number 22. Swiss steak. A round steak pounded thin with the edge of a saucer, dredged in flour, browned in a heavy skillet, then braised for 2 hours with stewed tomatoes, green pepper, and onion until a fork could cut it. 49 cents a pound at the A&P in 1964. The technique was called Swissing because the meat got rolled between fluted rollers at the butcher counter to break the fibers. Every family had a Wednesday version. The gravy went over mashed potatoes or buttered noodles. By the time microwaves hit kitchens in the late 1970s, nobody had 2 hours for a weeknight braise anymore. And the dish that smelled like Wednesday across half of America began to fade. But you could still find it on the menu of small-town diners through 1991, listed under blue plate specials with mashed potatoes and green beans for $3.75. Pecan-coated pork loin roast was a pretty festive dish that mostly was made out of pork loin that had been roasted and then further coated in this wonderful mix of crushed pecans. You threw in some breadcrumbs, seasonings, and then a little roasting to tie it all together, and you had yourself a certified hit of the 1980s and 1990s. These were featured as an entree and not a main course, actually, though I know it gives the opposite impression. It was definitely considered fine dining. The thing is, people really started focusing more on plant-based eating and vegetarianism in these past few years and decades. Fat was public enemy number one, and we can blame McDonald's well we want, but the seeds for this were sown a long time ago. You can't abuse cheese and bacon for so many decades and not ever expect to face some consequences. Plus, alternative ways to make pork were becoming more and more popular. This was just too complex, and pulled pork, pork chops, and pork belly were just more suitable and accessible ways to do it. The trick with tomato soup rice was that you never added plain water. You poured condensed Campbell's directly into the skillet with a cup of long-grain rice, diced onion, a strip of green pepper, and enough chicken broth to make the ratio right, then covered it and left it on low for 20 minutes. The rice absorbed everything, the tomato, the salt, the sweetness of the onion, and came out a pale orange red, each grain separate, faintly sticky at the edges. The people who grew up eating this called it Spanish rice, even though no one in Spain would have recognized it, and every household had a different version. Some added ground beef, some used beef broth, some added diced tomatoes alongside the soup. The version made with nothing but soup and rice cost almost nothing and kept in the refrigerator for 3 days. It appeared in 1960s budget cookbooks under meatless main dishes, with the suggestion to stretch it by adding a poached egg on top. Most people just ate it plain, standing at the stove. Number 17. Canned beef tamales. You pulled them out of the can still wrapped in their paper husks, peeled each one carefully so the masa did not stick, lined them up in a baking dish, and poured the chili sauce from the can over the top. Some people added shredded cheese or a spoonful of enchilada sauce before putting the dish in the oven for 20 minutes. The tamales came out soft and warm with the corn masa soaking up every drop of sauce. A single tall can held 6 tamales, enough for a full dinner with a side of rice or a handful of tortilla chips. Grocery stores across the Southwest and the Midwest stocked these by the case, and they disappeared off the shelf faster than almost any other canned meat product. People who grew up eating them can still describe the way the paper peeled away from the masa in one clean strip when the tamale was heated just right. Seafood. Newburgh was the luxurious first course that opened Christmas dinner with creamy richness and delicate shellfish. Lobster, shrimp, and sometimes crab meat were gently folded into a sauce of butter, cream, egg yolks, and sherry, The mixture served over toast points or in patty shells. The sauce was velvety and rich, coating each piece of seafood in decadent luxury that justified its holiday placement. Making Newburg required careful technique. The egg yolks could curdle if the sauce got too hot, ruining everything. Families served this as a first course before the main roast, a statement of abundance and sophistication. The dish came from Delmonico's restaurant in New York, spreading to home kitchens where ambitious cooks recreated its elegance. Seafood Newburg represented the era's formal dining culture, when Christmas dinner was multiple courses served with ceremony. It has largely vanished, replaced by simpler appetizers that don't require last-minute sauce making. Number 22. Cabbage and kielbasa. A head of cabbage sliced thin, a ring of kielbasa cut into rounds, a little water in the bottom of a Dutch oven, and you let the whole thing simmer until the cabbage was tender and the sausage had given up its fat into the pot. Polish and Czech families in the Midwest and Great Lakes region ate this weekly. Cabbage lasted for days in the cellar and stretched further than almost any other vegetable. The kielbasa added salt and smoke without requiring a large portion. Some cooks threw in a few quartered potatoes. One pot, no fuss, and the kitchen smelled like supper for hours before anyone sat down. At a glance, it looked like fried chicken on a stick. But take one bite, and the secret was out. There wasn't a shred of chicken in sight. In the 1960s, when poultry prices soared, working-class families in industrial cities like Pittsburgh, Cleveland, and Detroit turned to a clever alternative: skewered, breaded, and fried pork or veal, known as city chicken. The name was a bit of a joke. Chicken was considered a luxury in certain areas, but pork and veal, those were cheap, especially in regions with a strong meatpacking industry. But appearance mattered, and with a little ingenuity, cubed cuts of meat were threaded onto wooden skewers, giving the illusion of a drumstick. Once dredged in flour, dipped in egg wash, and coated in breadcrumbs, it was pan-fried until golden brown and crispy. Some families took it a step further, baking the skewers in a bit of broth for extra tenderness. Eastern European immigrants had been making versions of it since the early 20th century, and by the 1960s it was a staple at Sunday dinners and potlucks. It might not have been real chicken, but in a time when stretching a dollar mattered more than labels, it didn't need to be. Number 4. Pinto beans and cornbread. A pound of dried pintos soaked overnight and simmered all day long with a ham hock, a halved onion, and enough salt to draw it all together. The cornbread was baked in a cast-iron skillet greased with bacon drippings, and the bottom crust came out dark and crunchy and faintly smoky. You crumbled the cornbread into a deep bowl, ladled the beans over the top, and ate it with a raw sliced onion on the side if you grew up in the right part of the country. Across the South and the Ozarks, pinto beans and cornbread was Monday dinner every single Monday, because the beans needed a full day to simmer, and Monday was wash day, the day you stayed near the house anyway. The whole meal cost pennies. The ritual of making it cost nothing at all. Number 17. Pasta and peas. You diced a potato, diced half an onion, fried them in olive oil until soft, dumped in a can of peas with its liquid, added water to cook a half pound of rigatoni. A woman named Clara Canucciari grew up eating it in upstate New York during the Depression and made it famous on YouTube at age 91 before she passed at 98. She said pasta was the crutch her family leaned on when there was no meat for the table, no money for the rent, and no light at the end of the calendar. The potato thickens the broth, the pea liquid salts the sauce, the pasta holds on to everything. 40 cents in 1934. $2 and change today. Cheaper than fast food? Better than fast food. Clara cooked the pasta directly in the pea water because the starch and the canning salt built a glossy sauce without butter. She made it the way her grandmother had on a wood stove. Fried rice was the kitchen's answer to, "What can I do with leftovers?" You took yesterday's rice, never fresh, always cold, and tossed it in a hot pan with oil. Add eggs if you had them. Add vegetables if they were not wilted. Add soy sauce and stir until everything sizzled. Sometimes there was meat, bits of chicken, strips of Spam, leftover pork chops cut into tiny pieces. It was not a recipe. It was a response to scarcity. Every ingredient was a compromise that somehow came together as comfort. You learned to make it without measuring, without rules, just instinct and need. But often, it was just rice and hope. Fried rice was the clean-out-the-fridge dish, the we-cannot-waste-anything dish. It was salty, savory, and never tasted the same way twice. But it always worked. It fed a crowd, it reheated well, and it made you feel like a real cook, even if all you did was throw things in a pan. Squirrel and gravy was the hunter's reward that turned small game into sustenance when store-bought meat was a luxury. Grandpa would bring home squirrels cleaned and ready, and Grandma would cut them into pieces, dredge them in seasoned flour, and fry them slowly in lard until golden brown and tender. The meat was removed while she made gravy in the same skillet, stirring flour into the drippings and adding milk until it thickened into something rich with wild flavor. Squirrel meat was darker than chicken, slightly gamey, but absolutely delicious when prepared by hands that knew what they were doing. The gravy stretched the meal, ladled over biscuits and rice to feed a family from just 2 or 3 small animals. This dish appeared throughout fall and winter when squirrels were fat and plentiful in the hickory groves. No recipe existed because none was needed. Country women knew how to fry meat and make gravy the way they knew how to breathe. It was survival cooking elevated to something genuinely delicious. Salt pork and potato skillet was the dish that fed families when nothing else remained in the cellar but preserved meat and root vegetables. Salt pork, heavily cured pork belly that kept for months without refrigeration, was sliced and fried in cast iron until it rendered crispy cracklings floating in pure white fat. Thick sliced potatoes went into that fat, absorbing salty richness as they fried until edges turned golden and centers became creamy. Onions were often added for sweetness, and the whole skillet came to the table still sizzling. The dish required no fresh ingredients, nothing that couldn't survive winter in a root cellar. Families during lean times knew they could always manage if they had salt pork put away and potatoes stored in sand. The meal provided fat for energy, carbohydrates for fuel, and enough salt to keep bodies working through hard physical labor. This wasn't fancy eating. It was survival food that happened to taste like comfort itself. Pork and sauerkraut are things that come right out of German-American communities. Put this in a pot and leave it to cook, and let the fragrance carry you right to the streets of Munich and Prague, where New Year's celebrations meant that everyone had an incredible amount of pork and sauerkraut available all the time. It's definitely a historical middle-class dish associated with the late 1900s, and the slow cooking meant that even really tough cuts of pork could become tender, soft, melt-in-your-mouth slices of pork that got anyone's appetite going. When people were exploring foods from other countries, Pennsylvania in particular took a big interest in German food. Maybe because it had its fair share of German-American communities, or maybe because it was just that good. But either way, if you wanted to take an express tour into what German eating felt like, you would go on over to the Midwest or Pennsylvania to try this. Number 18. Banquet Veal Parmigiana Dinner. Veal Parmigiana sounds fancy until you see what Banquet did with it. A thin cutlet breaded and fried, covered in tomato sauce and a square of cheese that melted into a rubbery sheet. The sides were spaghetti and sauce and green beans. The cutlet was so thin you could almost see through it, and what Banquet called veal was generous by any measure. But the name carried weight. Veal Parmigiana was something people ordered in Italian restaurants when they wanted to feel like they were spending. Banquet brought it down to freezer aisle prices, and families served it on weeknights like it was nothing special. The cheese was processed, the breading was thick, and the spaghetti clumped together. Nobody cared. It felt like eating out without getting dressed. Number 15. Beef stroganoff over noodles. A pound of sirloin tips browned hard in a skillet, finished with sliced mushrooms and a pan sauce of beef broth, mustard, and a half pint of sour cream stirred in off the heat. Spooned over wide egg noodles. The dish came home with American GIs from Europe and entered the home cooking magazines by 1955. Through the 1960s, every Betty Crocker cookbook had a version. It was Saturday night dinner before company arrived. Fancy enough to feel like a treat, fast enough to make in 40 minutes. The sour cream curdled if the heat got too high. Mothers warned daughters about that one over the phone. By the time Hamburger Helper arrived in 1971 with a powdered version, the from-scratch dish was already retreating to special occasions. Today, it has retreated all the way out of the rotation. The roast Christmas goose was a cherished main player of all kinds of holiday season joy and feasting, especially around the northern and Midwest areas. The thing about this was that it became pretty much synonymous with warmth, good eating, and just a lot of tasty leftovers you could use the next day, too. This dish is now something you'd never see on holiday tables because it couldn't keep up with the shifting trends towards turkey. That protein was native to North America, and it was bigger than a goose and simply had more to offer per bird to any family. Plus, turkey farming had become sustainable and cheap, so prices for turkey were also pretty affordable. Geese, on the other hand, were seasonal and expensive. It wasn't something you could comfortably rely on to get, nor was it something that was easy to prepare either. You pile on a few years like that, and you can start to understand why geese just aren't the in thing anymore. Franks and beans was the dinner you made when the clock said 6:30, the wallet said empty, and the skillet was already on the burner before your coat was off. You opened a can of Van Camp's pork and beans, always Van Camp's, the sauce thicker than any store brand, sliced your Oscar Mayer wieners on the diagonal, added brown sugar and a squeeze of yellow mustard, and in 10 minutes had something smelling like a cookout for 30 cents. The trick was heat. Too high and the beans scorched to the bottom. Low and slow, lid half on, until the sauce thickened and the hot dog swelled and split at the edges. You ate it from the pan sometimes, crackers instead of a fork. Nobody was watching. That's the part nobody tells you about cooking alone. The freedom of it, the lack of theater. By the 1970s, frozen dinners brought the competition, and Franks and beans quietly left the table. The skillet that made it went to an estate sale with everything else. Number 24, sardines on toast. You opened the flat tin, laid the little fish across a piece of buttered toast, squeezed a few drops of lemon juice if you had half a lemon in the refrigerator, and ate them with a fork. The sardines were salty, oily, and rich enough to fill you up on 2 slices of bread and nothing else. Some people mashed them with a fork and spread them flat like a paste. Others left them whole and ate each one in 2 careful bites. A tin of sardines could sit in the pantry for years without going bad, and when you finally cracked it open, dinner was ready before the kettle finished boiling. This was old country food, the kind of supper that Portuguese and Italian grandparents brought over and never stopped making. Simple, fast, and filling enough to carry you through the night on pocket change. Plum pudding with hard sauce was the English tradition that concluded Christmas dinner with theatrical flames and boozy richness. The pudding itself was made weeks in advance, a dense mixture of sweet, dried fruits, spices, and breadcrumbs that aged until the flavors melded into something complex and deeply satisfying. On Christmas Day, the pudding was steamed for hours, then turned onto a platter and doused with brandy that was set alight, the blue flames dancing across its dark surface while guests applauded. Hard sauce, butter creamed with powdered sugar and more brandy, melted over hot slices, adding richness to every bite. Finding the hidden coin or charm baked inside brought luck to the finder. Families with English roots maintained this tradition for generations, the pudding recipe handed down carefully. The labor required and changing tastes that favored lighter desserts eventually ended the tradition for most families. Plum pudding represented a Christmas that demanded effort and rewarded patience. Number 24, scrapple. A Pennsylvania Dutch invention made from pork scraps and trimmings cooked down with cornmeal and spices until the mixture was thick enough to slice. You poured it into a pan, let it firm up in the icebox, then cut it into slabs and fried them until the outside was crackling and dark. The inside stayed soft and rich, somewhere between sausage and polenta. Scrapple was the ultimate waste-nothing food. The parts of the hog that had no other use got a second life in that loaf pan. In eastern Pennsylvania and parts of Maryland, scrapple was breakfast food, but plenty of families ate it for dinner with a side of applesauce or fried eggs. Hoosier pie supper was an answer to the age-old question. What can we make with what we have? Midwestern families, especially in Indiana, had been making similar dishes for generations, influenced by their farming roots and a deep tradition of waste not cooking. Mashed potatoes were a constant in working-class households, cheap, filling, and easy to make in large batches. A single pie could take scraps of roast beef, bits of ham, or even just a few spoonfuls of vegetables and turn them into a meal hearty enough to satisfy a family after a long day's work. It was baked until golden brown, emerging from the oven as a warm, comforting dish that filled the house with a familiar, savory aroma. Served with a ladle of brown gravy, it was about making sure nothing went to waste. In an era where food stretched as far as a paycheck, this dish wasn't just frugal, it was common sense wrapped in a flaky crust. Number 8. Hobo stew. Ground beef, canned corn, canned green beans, canned tomatoes, sliced potatoes, and a diced onion. Everything went into one pot, covered with water, and simmered until the potatoes turned soft and the starch thickened the broth all on its own. No browning the meat first, no complicated seasoning. Just salt, pepper, dump, and simmer. The name came from the Depression, when men riding freight trains pooled whatever scraps they could find and cooked them in a single pot over an open fire beside the tracks. By the 1960s, hobo stew had migrated into regular kitchens as the go-to meal for using up 3 cans of vegetables before they collected dust. It was not delicate, it was not attractive, it was everything you had in one pot, and that was the whole honest point. Number 23. Tomato soup cake. You measured a can of Campbell's condensed tomato soup straight into the mixing bowl, and you got a spice cake out of the oven that nobody could place. The recipe showed up in community cookbooks around 1928, when eggs and milk were too expensive, and the soup did the work of dairy. The cake came out moist and dense, with a cinnamon and clove crumb that tasted like a campfire spice cake. Campbell started printing the recipe on the soup label in 1960. Your great-aunt frosted it with cream cheese, served it on a Sunday plate, and let your uncle ask 3 times what kind of cake it was. She never told. The tomato acid activated the baking soda and gave the cake a tight crumb you cannot get with milk. The genius was always the sleight of hand. Nobody at the table knew they were eating a soup can. Instant coffee meat rub was one of those oddball ideas that somehow worked. You'd mix instant coffee crystals with sugar, salt, and a pinch of flour, rub it on cheap cuts of meat, and throw it in the oven or pan. The coffee acted like a smoky glaze, turning the outside dark and caramelized while hiding the fact that the meat was tough as rubber. It was a poor man's barbecue, full of flavor and pride. Families used it for pork, chicken, or whatever protein happened to be on sale. The smell filled the house like something from a steakhouse, and everyone gathered around pretending it was a special occasion. Even if the meat was chewy, no one complained. The magic of that bittersweet crust fooled everyone into believing it was better than it was. It was one of those small miracles from a time when making dinner meant making do. Fried cabbage with bacon was the simple side dish that could become a meal when paired with cornbread on lean nights. Grandma would chop a head of cabbage into rough wedges, not precise, just working, while bacon sizzled in a deep skillet. She removed the crispy bacon, then added the cabbage directly to the hot grease, letting it sizzle and wilt down into something sweet and slightly charred. The cabbage cooked until some pieces turned golden brown while others stayed pale green, creating texture variations that made each bite interesting. Crumbled bacon went back in at the end along with salt, pepper, and sometimes a splash of vinegar for brightness. The dish cost almost nothing. Cabbage was cheap and kept well in root cellars. Bacon was rendered from home-raised hogs. But it tasted rich, satisfying, and absolutely right alongside beans or potatoes. Grandma never measured anything, adjusting by sight and taste, knowing exactly when the cabbage had reached that perfect point between raw and overcooked. Chicken bog was a low-country Carolina tradition that turned one old hen and a bag of rice into a feast for a crowd. The dish got its name from the way rice bogged down in rich chicken broth, becoming almost creamy while still holding individual grains. A whole stewing hen, past her laying days, went into a large cast-iron pot with onions and celery, simmering until meat fell from bones. The chicken was pulled out and shredded while rice went directly into seasoned broth, cooking until it absorbed nearly all liquid. Shredded meat returned along with generous butter and black pepper. Everything stirred until the bog reached its characteristic consistency, wet but not soupy, rich but not heavy. Churches served it at fundraisers, families made it for reunions, and neighbors cooked it when someone needed feeding. One pot could serve 20 people, making chicken bog the original crowd-pleasing one-pot meal born from necessity and perfected through community. Number 24. Skillet Spanish rice. In 1949, General Foods launched Minute Rice on national television, and overnight rice became a weeknight staple. Before that, rice took 45 minutes on the stove. Minute rice took 5. The man who invented it was an Afghan-American engineer named Ataullah Ozai Durrani, who sold the process to General Foods in 1941. The Army used it first, then the suburbs did. Skillet Spanish rice was 4 strips of bacon fried in a pan, the onion and green pepper cooked in the drippings, a can of diced tomatoes, a cup of minute rice, and a shake of chili powder. You covered it and waited 5 minutes. The whole thing cost under 60 cents. It was the first time most American housewives cooked rice on a regular weeknight without thinking twice about it. Before minute rice, rice was a Sunday ingredient. After minute rice, it was a Tuesday one. That shift changed the shape of the American dinner plate. Number 20. Swanson Swiss Steak Dinner. Swiss steak had nothing to do with Switzerland. It was a tough cut of beef pounded flat with a meat mallet, braised in tomato sauce, and served with whatever vegetables were cheap that season. Swanson turned it into a frozen dinner with the steak in a reddish tomato gravy, mashed potatoes, and a vegetable medley that was mostly corn. The steak was thin and chewy, but the tomato sauce made up for it. Families who grew up eating Swiss steak at home recognized this dinner as a passable imitation. Families who did not grow up thinking, this is what Swiss steak was supposed to taste like. Swanson phased it out as newer options took over the limited freezer shelf space. The name alone confused a generation, and then it was gone. Number 13. Pot roast with Lipton onion soup mix. A 4-pound chuck roast browned in a Dutch oven, topped with a packet of Lipton dehydrated onion soup mix, a can of Campbell's cream of mushroom, and a splash of beef broth, then braised in a 325 oven for 3 hours. Carrots and potatoes piled around it for the last hour. Lipton printed the recipe on the back of every box from the early 1960s on, and Sunday dinner from Bangor to Bakersfield smelled the same because of it. Drive through a small town in Iowa at 4 on a Sunday and you would smell chuck roast through every screen door. The roast came out of the oven at 5. The family ate at 6. And the leftovers became hash on Tuesday. By the late 1990s, busy parents had switched to crockpots and roasted chickens. The Sunday roast moved to the Yankee Candle aisle as a scent. You can still buy the Lipton packet at any grocery store in the country. The packet outlived the Sunday it was meant for. So, with curried crab and watermelon salad, a pretty neat little tropical combo, there's never just one reason why this faded into obscurity the way it did. The crux of the issue this time was that it was an unfamiliar combination outside of the niche fan base it built up for itself. Sweet watermelon alongside pretty strong and spicy curry was just a divisive choice that didn't last long in the deck of most people. They had better and more synchronized options to go for, flavors that complement each other. Plus, there was also the health consciousness that's caused the downfall of so much on this list. People were going for more familiar watermelon recipes like salads instead of this. At first, its popularity was because it was the next new exotic thing that Americans could fantasize about. But when people went to actually try it, their illusions didn't really match up with reality. The expensiveness of the crab around the 2000s was also a pretty strong reason. Why hurt your wallet for something you aren't even sure about? Eventually, people just left dishes like these altogether and went to the tried and tested, stuff they knew worked and stuff they were familiar with. The stuffed bell pepper was the dinner that looked like effort. 1 green pepper, top cut off and seeds shaken out, packed with seasoned ground beef and raw rice, nestled upright in a saucepan. A can of tomato soup poured over it. Lid on. Simmered 45 minutes until the pepper went soft and the rice cooked through inside the meat. One pepper was exactly the right amount for one person, and it looked, on a plate, like someone had thought it through. The pepper cost about 5 cents. The ground beef cost maybe 20. A meal under 30 cents that looked considerably more intentional. She always made two, though, even when it was just her. One for dinner, one kept warm on the back of the stove in case someone stopped by. Nobody stopped by. The second pepper went into the refrigerator and she ate it for lunch the next day. Alone, which was not the same as having made it for someone and always would be. Number 13. Canned beef chow mein. La Choy sold it in a tall can with a separate, smaller can of crispy noodles banded to the side. You heated the chow mein in a skillet, poured it over the crunchy noodles on a plate, and ate it with a fork. The vegetables were soft and the beef was cut thin, almost shaved, floating in a sauce that tasted like soy and celery and something faintly sweet. It was not Chinese food. Nobody pretended it was. But it was hot and it was different from everything else on the shelf. And on a night when you could not face another plate of the same 3 things you had been eating all week, that difference was worth the price of the can. Seniors bought it because it required no additions, no sides, and no decisions. Open, heat, eat. The crunchy noodles on top made it feel like a real meal instead of something poured from a can, even though that is exactly what it was. Standing rib roast was the king of Christmas meats, its impressive size and rich marbling commanding respect from the moment it emerged from the oven. Butchers prepared these roasts with the bones still attached, creating a natural rack that elevated the meat for even cooking. The exterior was rubbed with garlic, salt, pepper, and fresh herbs, then roasted at high heat to create a deeply browned crust before the temperature dropped for slow cooking. Slicing revealed a gradient from well-done edges to rosy pink centers, allowing guests to choose their preferred doneness. The bones were fought over, gnawed clean at the table, or saved for soup. Yorkshire pudding was the traditional accompaniment, the batter puffing dramatically in the hot beef drippings. This was investment cooking, the roast costing more than a week's grocery budget, but justified by the holiday's importance. Standing rib roast represented prosperity and tradition, connecting American families to English Christmas customs. Number 28. Egg noodles with butter and black pepper. A pot of water, a handful of wide egg noodles, a pat of butter, and a few cracks of pepper. That was the whole dinner on nights when the grocery money ran out before the week did. Some mothers stirred in a spoonful of cottage cheese or a splash of canned milk to make it feel richer. Others cracked an egg into the hot noodles and let the heat cook it through. It was bland by restaurant standards and perfect by the standards of anyone who had been on their feet since dawn. The children ate it without argument because it was soft and warm. Parents reached for it because the cupboard could always produce it. Mid-century America had a love affair with convenience, and nothing sold homemakers on a recipe faster than a catchy advertising campaign. In the 1960s, Wesson Oil promoted a dish that promised flavor, affordability, and, of course, a little Wessonality. It started with ground beef, one of the most budget-friendly proteins of the era, mixed with canned green beans and tomato soup, then topped with a generous handful of crushed potato chips. A little crunch, a little sauce, and a whole lot of practicality. Wessonality Surprise was designed for speed and efficiency. No complicated steps, no long cooking times. Just a few pantry staples thrown together and baked into something that resembled a casserole. Canned green beans, already a staple in American kitchens, made the dish feel like a balanced meal, while the condensed tomato soup added a rich, slightly sweet tang. For families in the 60s, this kind of cooking was about making every dollar count. It was fast, it was filling, and thanks to Wesson's marketing, it became one of many quirky ad-driven meals that defined a generation of home cooking. A little strange? Maybe. But for busy families, it worked. Number 22. American goulash. This had nothing to do with the Hungarian original. American goulash was a pound of ground beef browned in a Dutch oven, tossed with elbow macaroni, a can of stewed tomatoes, and a heavy pour of store-brand tomato sauce. Salt, pepper, maybe a shake of garlic powder if you were feeling bold. The whole pot fed 6 people for about $1.20, and it reheated the next day even better than it tasted fresh. In factory towns across Ohio and Michigan, goulash was Wednesday night. Not because anyone planned it that way. By Wednesday, you were tired, and the box of macaroni was always sitting in the cupboard. Mothers stirred it with one hand while holding a toddler on the opposite hip, and the pot was scraped clean by Thursday lunch. Number 9. Bean and bacon soup over crackers. You crumbled 2 strips of bacon into a pot, sweated half a chopped onion in the fat, added 2 cans of navy beans with liquid, a can of tomato sauce, 3 cups of water, salt, pepper, and a bay leaf, and simmered 45 minutes. You served it in a bowl over a handful of crushed saltines. Campbell's started selling bean and bacon soup in a red and white can in 1908, and by the worst years of the Depression, it was the cheapest hot calorie a family could buy at the grocery counter. 11 cents a can. It fed 3 people. The crackers were the second meal hiding inside the first one, because they thickened the broth into something that ate like a stew. Your father drank the last spoonful straight from the bowl. Your mother never said a word. The genius was the math. A sleeve of saltines cost a nickel and stretched the soup into 2 suppers because the broth that would have evaporated was bound by the cracker starch. Corncob jelly was one of the most surprising Depression-era creations, turning what was usually discarded into something sweet and useful. After eating or cutting kernels from corn, families would boil the stripped cobs for a long time until the liquid turned golden. With sugar and sometimes pectin, this liquid became a jelly that spread easily on bread or biscuits. It had a mild corn flavor, slightly sweet, and it gave people a way to stretch ingredients without buying fruit for jams. Since sugar was often rationed or expensive, this jelly was seen as a clever way to create a sweet treat out of nothing more than scraps. Many families remembered it fondly, not only because it was thrifty, but because it represented resourcefulness at its finest. Children often spread it on cornbread or stale bread softened in milk, turning waste into dessert. It may seem odd today, but back then it was pure ingenuity. Cracklin' bread was cornbread elevated by the precious remnants of hog butchering when nothing from the animal went to waste. After rendering lard from pork fat, Grandma saved the crispy brown bits left behind, cracklings that tasted like concentrated pork flavor. She stirred them directly into cornbread batter made from cornmeal, buttermilk, and a little lard, creating something richer than plain cornbread could ever be. The cracklings softened slightly during baking, but kept enough chew to provide texture in every bite. Grandma knew exactly how many cracklings to add without measuring, adjusting for how much fat remained on them. This bread appeared only after hog killing, usually in late fall, making it a seasonal treasure that families anticipated all year. The technique required understanding pork fat, knowing when cracklings were ready, and trusting your eyes over any written measurement. It was knowledge that lived in doing, not reading, and it made ordinary cornbread extraordinary. Tripe and onions turned the least glamorous part of the cow into something surprisingly delicate and satisfying. Tripe, the honeycomb-textured stomach lining, required hours of cleaning and simmering before it became tender enough to eat. Once prepared, the tripe was sliced thin and cooked in a cast-iron skillet with abundant onions, butter, and milk until everything melded into a creamy, rich dish. The texture was unlike anything else, slightly chewy but yielding, with a mild flavor that absorbed the sweetness of slow-cooked onions. Working-class families valued tripe because butchers practically gave it away, considering it waste. Those who knew how to prepare it understood they were getting genuine protein for almost nothing. The dish appeared regularly in immigrant communities where nose-to-tail eating was simply how things were done. Served over toast or with crusty bread to soak up the creamy sauce, tripe and onions provided comfort that cost almost nothing but delivered satisfaction that rivaled expensive cuts. Number 9. Green bean casserole. In 1955, a home economist named Dorcas Riley at Campbell's Test Kitchen in Camden, New Jersey, was told to create a recipe using two ingredients assumed to be in every American pantry: canned green beans and cream of mushroom soup. She added soy sauce, black pepper, milk, and French fried onions on top. 6 ingredients. 1 baking dish. 350 degrees for 30 minutes. The dish did not test well internally. Riley pushed it through anyway. In 2002, Campbell's and Riley donated the original recipe card to the National Inventors Hall of Fame. As of recent estimates, the dish is served at 20 million Thanksgiving tables every year. 40% of all cream of mushroom soup sold in America goes into this single recipe. A trained corporate home economist, not a home cook, created the most replicated recipe in the country. That was the 1950s. Number 25. Swanson Chopped Sirloin Beef Dinner. The name made it sound like something from a steakhouse, but the reality was a pressed patty of ground beef sitting in a puddle of brown gravy next to a scoop of instant mashed potatoes and a pile of green beans. Swanson put this one out in the early 1960s and marketed it as a premium option. The sirloin was generous labeling. Most of it was standard ground beef with seasonings and filler, shaped into a rectangle and covered in gravy dark enough to hide the seams. You ate it on a TV tray in the living room while Walter Cronkite read the news. Nobody complained because nobody expected a chop house. They expected dinner without dishes, and that is exactly what they got. The original version in the aluminum tray has not been produced in decades. Number 23. Liver and onions. A pound of sliced calf liver dredged in seasoned flour, seared in bacon drippings, and smothered in onions cooked until they collapsed. Mashed potatoes on the side, a glass of milk for the kids who knew better than to argue. Through the 1960s, your grandmother kept liver on the rotation every other Thursday because it was cheap and what the doctor told a tired wife to feed her husband. The dish disappeared because the children who choked it down vowed never to serve it themselves. By 1985, most butchers had stopped carrying it in the front case. What most people miss about Thursday liver is how completely a weeknight staple could vanish in 20 years. One generation ate it without question. The next refused to even smell it. Turkey sausage rolls were just a case of the better man, or in this case, the better sausage winning. See, people just gravitate more towards pork sausages, as it was also the traditional choice for sausage rolls, and because it had a lot more flavor and savory notes than turkey ones did. I mean, people did eventually get a little tired of them, so they switched to turkey rolls, like that one little guilty pleasure you go to. Unfortunately, they just didn't have the oomph that pork sausages did. They were leaner, they were healthier, but they didn't have that flavor no matter what people did. And stealing sausage rolls from Americans might as well be a first-class felony. Whether it was before work, on your way to an interview, or just on the drive back home, these rolls were street food incarnate, and they were available everywhere. So people really got attached to that classic pork sausage roll taste. Plus, while the health benefits were there, they just weren't that overwhelmingly in favor of turkey sausage rolls. Also, a lot of the places where people got sausage rolls, turkey or pork, were frozen foods in grocery markets, which also tend to prioritize plant-based options a lot more than meat nowadays, thanks to the shift in trends. Tamale pie was what you made when ground beef and a can of beans needed to become something that actually felt like dinner. Brown the beef with onion and garlic, add kidney beans, canned tomatoes, chili powder, and cumin, let it thicken. Pour a cornbread batter over the top, cornmeal, flour, egg, milk, bake at 400 degrees for 25 minutes. The recipe had circulated in American cookbooks since the 1930s, when Midwestern agricultural extension pamphlets recommended it as a practical way to stretch inexpensive ground beef. By the 1960s, it appeared in budget cookbooks nationwide, often noted as makes 2 meals. The genius was the crust. It absorbed the chili juices from below while baking, so the bottom was dark and moist and spiced while the top stayed dry and crisp. 2 completely different textures in the same dish. You had to decide which half you wanted first. Both choices were right, and you never quite made up your mind before the dish was empty. Number 22. Corned beef hash. Open the can, dump the hash into a skillet, press it flat with a spatula, and let the bottom crust up for about 5 minutes without touching it. That crust was the whole point. Without it, you had warm mush. With it, you had something that crunched when the fork went through. Some people cracked an egg on top and covered the skillet to let it steam. Others ate it plain with ketchup and a piece of white bread. A can of corned beef hash from the grocery store was one of the cheapest hot dinners you could put together in under 10 minutes. You did not need to add a thing to it. Open, fry, eat. 3 steps, no leftovers. Crown roast of pork was the showstopper centerpiece that announced a family's prosperity and a mother's skill the moment guests entered the dining room. Butchers would French the rib bones and curve them into a majestic crown shape, each bone tip adorned with a paper frill that made the roast look almost too elegant to eat. The center was filled with savory stuffing, often bread-based with apples, onions, and sage, that cooked inside the meat, absorbing all those rich pork juices. Families ordered these roasts weeks in advance from local butchers who knew exactly how to prepare them. The presentation was theatrical, carried to the table on the best silver platter while everyone gasped and applauded. Carving required precision, with the host carefully separating each chop while keeping the crown intact as long as possible. The meat was succulent, the stuffing rich, and the experience unforgettable. Crown roast represented an era when Christmas dinner was performance as much as meal, when presentation mattered deeply. Number 30. Corn oysters. Sweet corn kernels scraped off the cob, mixed with egg, flour, salt, and pepper, then dropped by the spoonful into a skillet of hot lard. The batter puffed up as it fried, and the edges turned brown and crisp while the center stayed soft and sweet. They were called oysters because the shape and the golden crust resembled a fried oyster. Farm families across the Midwest and Mid-Atlantic made these all through corn season because the ingredient list was whatever you already had. You piled them on a plate and ate them with nothing else, or alongside a slice of ham if the budget allowed. In the Appalachian Mountains, resourcefulness was a way of life. When fresh food wasn't always guaranteed, families learned how to make the most of what they had, and that's where soured corn soup came in. This dish started with dried corn that had been left to ferment slightly, giving it a tangy depth of flavor. Simmered with onions and a chunk of fatback, it transformed into a rich, hearty soup that was as practical as it was unique. Corn was the backbone of Appalachian cooking, grown in backyard gardens and stored for winter months. Allowing it to sour slightly wasn't a mistake. It was a method passed down for generations, a natural way to enhance flavor when refrigeration wasn't an option. Fatback, a common cut of cured pork, added just enough richness to make the dish feel substantial, while onions provided a little sweetness to balance out the tang. This wasn't the kind of soup you'd find in a restaurant, but for mountain families, it was a familiar and comforting meal. Some grew up eating it with cornbread on the side, others with a spoon straight from the pot. Cucumber vinegar salad was a refreshing Depression-era side dish that added brightness to otherwise plain meals. Cucumbers were easy to grow in home gardens, and when combined with vinegar, water, and a pinch of sugar or salt, they became a simple but flavorful salad. Thinly sliced and chilled if possible, the cucumbers soaked up the tangy brine and provided crunch. For families living on beans, bread, and potatoes, this salad was a welcome change in texture and taste. It required almost no cooking, which was another benefit when fuel and time were scarce. Often served in large bowls at supper, it gave the sense of a fresh vegetable dish without requiring expensive ingredients. Sometimes onions or dill were added, but the core recipe was basic and thrifty. For many households, cucumber vinegar salad was a reminder that gardening and resourcefulness could provide something close to luxury in the hardest times. Number 25. Hoover stew. You learned this one in a soup line in 1932 because they were the only kitchen still cooking. A pot of macaroni, a can of stewed tomatoes, a can of corn, and whatever hot dogs the butcher could not sell that week. They named it after the president who took the blame, and Hooverville families ate it 3 nights a week for a decade. And the trick was the order. You cooked the macaroni first, drained most of the liquid, then dropped the tomatoes and corn into the same pot so the pasta starch thickened the broth without flour. 1 pot, 1 burner, 20 minutes total. The whole pan cost 20 cents in 1933 and fed 5. But a single mother in a Hooverville tent could put a hot supper on a folding table with 2 cans, 1 box of macaroni, and a stove that ran on scrap wood. Your grandmother called it supper. She was not ashamed. Cornmeal drop dumplings in broth were a warm meal born from desperation and a little genius. When meat was scarce and soup looked too thin, a quick cornmeal batter could save dinner. You'd mix cornmeal with water or milk, pinch off little balls, and drop them into bubbling broth to puff and soak up the flavor. They came out soft, dense, and delicious, tiny golden pillows floating in the pot. The smell of simmering broth filled the house, carrying a quiet promise that everyone would eat tonight. It was the kind of recipe that stretched the smallest pot of soup into something that could feed a family. Some added onions or pepper, others just relied on the broth to do the heavy lifting. Either way, it worked. Cornmeal drop dumplings didn't just fill bellies, they lifted spirits. They were proof that a handful of meal and water could turn hunger into gratitude. Cornmeal mush and molasses was the breakfast that cost almost nothing but provided everything a body needed to face hard work. Grandma would boil water in a heavy pot, then slowly stream coarse cornmeal into the bubbling liquid while stirring constantly with a wooden spoon worn smooth from decades of use. The mixture had to cook slowly, requiring patience to prevent lumps or scorching. When it reached the right thickness, something only her hands knew, she spooned it steaming into bowls and drizzled thick blackstrap molasses over the top. The combination of corn's earthiness and molasses' mineral-rich sweetness created something that tasted like sustenance itself. Children ate it before school. Men ate it before dawn chores. The leftover mush was poured into loaf pans, chilled until firm, sliced, and fried in bacon grease for supper. Nothing was wasted. The dish demanded no recipe because the proportions lived in muscle memory, passed from grandmother to mother to daughter through watching, not reading. Cast iron squirrel and rice turned small game, every child learned to hunt into a complete dinner requiring nothing but one heavy skillet. Young hunters brought home their catch cleaned and quartered, ready for the pan where pieces browned in lard until skin turned crispy. The squirrel was set aside while onions and celery softened, followed by long-grain rice that toasted until translucent. Stock was added along with the browned squirrel, then the skillet was covered until rice absorbed every bit of liquid and meat pulled easily from delicate bones. The flavor was nutty and rich, the squirrel meat darker and more complex than chicken could ever be. For rural families, this represented abundance found in woods behind their homes rather than expensive grocery stores. Children learned hunting wasn't sport, it was survival, and their contributions carried genuine weight. One skillet, a few squirrels, and a cup of rice meant dinner was handled with real dignity. Black cherry jello. Salad was one of those dishes that combined sweetness and tang in a way that made it a staple at family gatherings and church potlucks. It used dark cherry gelatin as its base, which gave the dish a deep color and bold flavor. Cooks would fold in canned fruit, often pineapple or cherries, and add a layer of sour cream or whipped topping to balance the sweetness. The contrast of creamy and fruity layers made each spoonful a different experience, with textures that ranged from smooth to juicy. It was easy to prepare, could be made ahead of time, and looked elegant when served in a glass dish or mold. For many families, this salad brought a festive touch to the table, especially at holidays, where it added color and flavor alongside more traditional fare. Though it has largely faded from today's recipe collections, it remains remembered for its vibrant appearance and unique flavor combination. Number 13. Morton Beef Dinner. Morton was always the least expensive option in the freezer case, and the beef dinner showed exactly where they cut costs. A thin slice of beef in brown gravy, a serving of mashed potatoes from flakes, and a vegetable that was either corn or mixed vegetables depending on the production run. The gravy was the dominant flavor. It covered everything and tasted the same whether it sat on beef, turkey, or chicken. Morton sold millions of these trays to families who could not justify the extra cost for Swanson. The portion was smaller, The quality was exactly what the price promised, and Morton never pretended otherwise. Their entire business was built on being the cheapest option, and that honesty kept them in freezers for years. Number 16. Pork chops and applesauce with shake and bake. 4 bone-in chops shaken in a paper bag of seasoned breadcrumbs and baked at 425 until the coating turned crisp. A jar of Mott's applesauce on the side, lukewarm, straight from the refrigerator. Shake and bake hit shelves in 1965, and within 4 years, it was in roughly 1 in 3 American kitchens. The Brady Bunch made the line famous when Peter Brady said pork chops and applesauce in his Humphrey Bogart voice. The dish was Tuesday and Thursday food. It was simple. It was effective. By the 1990s, the box had moved to the bottom shelf. The chops thinned out. The applesauce got organic. Nobody under 40 knows the rhythm of shaking a bag, the small percussive sound it made. Chicken ballotine with olive and fig tapenade was once a high-end holiday meal that you'd always go out for when you wanted a fancy winter dinner right around Christmas Eve. A ballotine itself is just boneless stuffed chicken that's been tied up and roasted well, but the real killer here is that tapenade. It adds a world of flavor and depth to the dish that otherwise just isn't there. The dish gives off luxury dining energy. I mean, it just sounds expensive too. Unfortunately, you can definitely be a top order on the menu of a 5-star restaurant that's always packed for the holidays and still just fall off. Stuffed chicken only sounds easy in theory. In actuality, it's a lot of work. You need to bone the chicken, then make the stuffing, and then you need to roll and tie it with a lot of attention to detail. Otherwise, it'll fall apart during the roasting. Have you ever heard of how people don't like to eat what they make because they're usually a bit tired after cooking? Imagine that, but times 10 here. There were simpler ways to make chicken that didn't take up most of your time and left you with only a little bit left to actually enjoy while you ate and relaxed. Before Hamburger Helper arrived in 1971, people stretching ground beef into a full dinner were already doing it themselves. And in New England, they'd called the result American chop suey for decades, a name with nothing to do with Chinese food and everything to do with the Depression-era habit of giving humble dishes whatever label made dinner sound more interesting. Brown the beef with diced onion, pour in undiluted Campbell's tomato soup and a can of water, bring to a simmer, drop in dry elbow macaroni right in the skillet, stir for 20 minutes. The Encyclopedia of American Food and Drink traces chop suey in American usage to the late 19th century, but the elbow mac version became the signature of New England working-class cooking in the post-war years. The Midwest called it American goulash. Parts of the South called it macaroni red. It fed whoever needed feeding by whatever name and left the pot easy to wash. When cooking alone, that mattered almost as much as the eating. Number 11. Canned turkey and gravy over rice. You heated the canned turkey and gravy together in a saucepan, stirring slowly until the gravy smoothed out and the turkey broke into soft, pale pieces. Spooned it over a mound of white rice and ate it with a fork. This tasted closer to a Thanksgiving leftover plate than anything else you could pull from a shelf in the middle of March. The canned gravy was thick and peppery, and the turkey, while softer than the roasted kind, carried enough savory depth to make the rice disappear one forkful at a time. A can of turkey and a cup of dry rice fed one person twice. You ate it hot the first night and cold the next morning straight from the container, standing at the counter before the coffee finished brewing. Scalloped potatoes au gratin were the bubbling, golden casserole that emerged from ovens across America, their creamy layers and crispy cheese topping satisfying even the pickiest guests. Potatoes were sliced thin by hand, no food processors yet, then layered in baking dishes with butter, flour, cream, and sharp cheddar cheese. The casserole baked slowly, the potatoes softening as the sauce thickened and the top turned golden brown. Each serving revealed those beautiful layers, potato slices held together by rich, cheesy sauce. Families made these potatoes for every major holiday, the recipe unchanged for generations. The dish required time and attention, the potatoes needing thin, even slices for proper cooking. Children loved the crispy edges and cheese, while adults appreciated how the richness complemented roast meats. Modern scalloped potatoes often use shortcuts, but nothing matches the version made from scratch with patience and real cream. Number 17. Red beans and rice. Dried red kidney beans soaked overnight, then simmered all day with a ham hock, onion, celery, bell pepper, garlic, and bay leaves. The beans cooked down until they were creamy and thick, and you spooned them over a mound of white rice. This was a Monday tradition in New Orleans because Monday was wash day, and the beans could simmer unattended while the laundry hung on the line. But red beans and rice traveled far beyond Louisiana. Families across the South made their own versions with whatever smoked meat they had on hand. The beans were cheap, the rice was filler, and the ham hock gave the whole pot a deep smoky flavor that tasted like it took more effort than it did. When tomato sauce wasn't in the pantry and butter wasn't an option, a surprising combination stepped in: mayonnaise and mustard. Tossed with hot spaghetti noodles and seasoned with a dash of salt and pepper, this unusual pairing became a quick-fix meal known as mayo and mustard spaghetti, which was both budget-friendly and undeniably memorable. Spaghetti itself was one of the most affordable dry goods available, filling enough to feed a family without requiring much else. Mayonnaise, often stocked in refrigerators for sandwiches and salads, brought richness and a creamy texture, while mustard added just enough tang to keep things interesting. It wasn't gourmet, but it turned plain pasta into something that felt like a complete dish without the need for meat, cheese, or expensive sauces. In working-class households, meals like this weren't about following a recipe. They were about making do with what was available. Kids grew up eating it straight from the pot, a quick meal before heading outside to play or finishing homework at the kitchen table. It may not have been a dinner guests would rave about, but for those who remember it, the taste still lingers as a reminder of simpler times and just how far a few basic ingredients could go. Number 20. Oxtail soup. Butchers used to practically give oxtails away because nobody with money wanted them. A couple pounds of oxtails, a few carrots, celery, an onion, and enough water to fill a stock pot. You simmered it for 3 or 4 hours until the meat slid off the bone and the broth turned dark and gelatinous from the collagen. No thickener needed. A bowl of oxtail soup on a January night in 1958 was one of the most satisfying dinners a family could eat, and the whole pot cost less than $1. Today, oxtails sell for $8 or $9 a pound at most grocery stores. The dinner that poor families made because they could not afford anything better became too expensive for those same families to make. Number 7. Cabbage and noodle skillet. You shredded half a head of green cabbage, chopped 1 onion, melted 4 tablespoons of butter in a wide skillet, and cooked it slowly 25 minutes until the pan turned a sweet brown. You boiled half a pound of egg noodles separately, drained them, dumped them into the cabbage, salted heavily, peppered heavily, and ate it straight from the skillet. The dish came from Polish, Hungarian, and Slovak grandmothers who landed in western Pennsylvania between 1880 and 1925. A head of cabbage cost a nickel in 1934. It still costs less than $2. The cabbage is what a Johnstown family ate when the mill shut down in 1977. It still works. The heat had to stay low for the full 25 minutes. A hot pan turned the cabbage gray and sour. A patient pan caramelized the leaves and coated the noodles in a sweet, nutty glaze. Mashed potatoes with hamburger gravy were the comforting, savory meal that made kids race to the table before the pot even left the stove. Mothers browned small amounts of ground meat, then stretched every drop of drippings into a rich gravy with flour, water, and simple seasoning. Poured over a mound of fluffy potatoes, the gravy turned an inexpensive side into a full meal. Kids loved how the potatoes soaked up the sauce, every bite warm and satisfying. It felt indulgent without being complicated or costly. Mothers appreciated how far a single pound of meat could go when used this way, feeding several people with ease. Kids begged for it because it tasted like the kind of comfort only home could offer. Mashed potatoes with hamburger gravy were proof that thrift could still taste like abundance. Rabbit stew was the reward for successful hunting when wild cottontails were plentiful in fields and brush piles. Grandma would joint the rabbit into pieces, brown them in bacon fat, then add water or stock along with whatever vegetables the root cellar provided: potatoes, carrots, onions, turnips. The The stew simmered for hours until the rabbit meat turned tender enough to fall from the bone, its mild flavor infusing the broth. She thickened the liquid with a bit of flour mixed with cold water, creating gravy that clung to every piece of meat and vegetable. Wild rabbit was leaner than domestic meat, requiring slow cooking and plenty of fat to keep it from drying out. The stew appeared throughout winter when fresh meat was scarce, but small game remained available to those who knew how to hunt and prepare it. No recipe guided the process. Grandma added vegetables by eye, thickened by feel, seasoned by taste, cooking until her experience told her it was done. Smothered rabbit with onions transformed wild game into Sunday-worthy eating through patience and a heavy cast-iron lid. Hunters returned with cottontails cleaned and jointed, ready to be dredged in seasoned flour and browned in bacon drippings until golden. The browned pieces were removed, while thick sliced onions went into the same fat, cooking down soft and sweet. The rabbit returned to nestle among onions, everything covered with just enough water to create steam, and the heavy lid went on. The skillet simmered for hours, tough meat slowly surrendering to tenderness, while onions melted into silky gravy. Families valued this because wild rabbit cost nothing but the hunt, and long cooking required little attention while chores got done. The finished rabbit fell off the bone into gravy, carrying the richness of bacon fat and natural sweetness of slow-cooked onions. One skillet fed a family of 6 with nothing left but clean bones and full stomachs. Dr. Pepper pulled pork is something that comes right out of the aces of Southern barbecue traditions. You'll find vintage cookbooks calling for the use of a smoker, but the one-pot version makes it all way more convenient for you. All you need is a slow cooker, Dr. Pepper, and a great cut of pork you can trust with a blind eye, and then you're set. Usually people use Dutch ovens, but a lot of commercial slow cookers became very affordable and easily available. The best advantage of this way of cooking was that you could prepare a variety of other things like sides and desserts while this was cooked, as it didn't need any attention from you. The pork would caramelize without any worries, and the acidity from the soda would help make it an even more tender meal. The stove is cold now in most of those kitchens, and the women who stood at them are mostly gone. But every single one of those 100 dinners lived long enough to land in somebody's memory, and that is the only recipe box that never gets thrown away. If your family made any of these, leave a comment and tell us which one you still think about. Share this video with someone who would remember the smell. And if you have not subscribed yet, now is a good time, because there is more where this came from.